My name is Harper Sterling. I am 33 years old and I am a senior financial auditor. For 6 years, the man who kissed me goodnight, who promised to build an empire by my side, was living a phantom life. He successfully hid a mistress and a 6-year-old child I never knew existed. He thought he was untouchable, but his intricate web of lies unraveled entirely because of one tiny careless mistake. The truth finally came out, proving that a deceptive man can hide many things, but he can never outsmart a woman trained to follow the paper trail. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled his secret life piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that a woman's intuition is always right and that betrayal deserves absolute justice. It was a chilly Tuesday evening in late March. Tax season is always chaotic in my line of work, but I pride myself on keeping our personal finances immaculate. Julian, my husband of 8 years, is a highly successful real estate developer. He is charismatic, meticulously organized, and always smells faintly of expensive sandalwood. He casually mentioned leaving a crucial property tax addendum in the center console of his black SUV. I needed it to finalize our joint returns. I walked out to our driveway, pulled my coat tighter against the brisk Chicago wind, and slipped into the driver's seat of his car. The interior was pristine. I flipped open the center console. Nothing, just a spare charging cable and some mints. Annoyed but unbothered, I leaned over to check the glove box. I popped it open, shuffling through the vehicle registration, the insurance cards, and the heavy owner manual. Still no tax document. But as I pushed the manual back into place, my fingers brushed against something strange. It was a slight indentation near the top interior panel of the glove compartment, a seam that did not belong there. I pressed it. With a soft click, a false top dropped down, revealing a hidden compartment about the size of a cigar box. My breath hitched. Julian was not the type of man to install secret compartments unless he had something significant to hide. My hands began to tremble as I reached inside. The first thing I pulled out was a sleek black plastic device, an Easy Pass toll transponder. We both already had registered toll passes linked to our shared bank accounts. Why would he need a ghost transponder, unlisted and untraceable, hidden away in his car? My mind raced with logical explanations, but the auditor in me immediately recognized the red flag of off-the-books travel. I reached into the dark void again. My fingers met the crinkled texture of a receipt. I pulled it out into the dim overhead light of the SUV. It was a standard thermal paper receipt from a pediatric dental clinic located in a wealthy Connecticut suburb roughly 40 miles away from our home. The date was from just 3 days ago, but it was the name printed at the top that made my blood run entirely cold. Patient name, Leo Lawson, age 6. Procedure, routine cleaning and sealant. Paid in cash, $350. I sat frozen. The leather seat beneath me felt like ice. I read the name again. Leo Lawson, age 6. I read the age again, and then my vision blurred as the reality of that number struck me with the force of a physical blow. 6 years old. The math in my head was instantaneous and utterly devastating. 6 years ago, Julian and I were living through the darkest chapter of our lives. I had been 7 months pregnant with our first child, a baby girl we had already named and loved. We painted the nursery pale yellow. We built the crib. And then a sudden complication, an emergency surgery, and a terrible silence in the delivery room that still haunts my nightmares. The loss nearly broke me, but what hurt just as much was watching Julian shut down. He cried in my arms for a week, and then he packed up the nursery while I was asleep. When I finally found the strength to talk about trying again, he looked at me with hollow eyes and said he was too traumatized. He said the fear of losing me, of going through that pain again, was too much to bear. He convinced me that we were enough for each other, that our careers and our love were all we needed. I believed him. I swallowed my grief, focused entirely on my career, and supported his real estate ambitions. I sacrificed my dream of a family because I thought I was protecting the man I loved from unbearable pain. But sitting in his car, gripping this crumpled piece of paper, the truth shattered my reality. He was not traumatized. He was busy. While I was grieving in an empty yellow room, he was out getting another woman pregnant. While I was burying our daughter, he was welcoming a son, a boy who was now 6 years old, a boy named Leo. A boy whose dental bills were paid in cash by a man who claimed he could not stomach the thought of being a father. The oxygen vanished from the car. I gasped for air, leaning my forehead against the steering wheel as a tidal wave of nausea hit me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to march back into the house, throw this receipt in his face, and watch his perfect, charismatic mask crumble. I wanted to break everything he owned, but as the tears threatened to spill, something shifted inside me. The heartbroken wife who had blindly trusted her husband died right there in the front seat of that SUV. In her place, the senior financial auditor woke up. An auditor does not scream. An auditor does not make accusations without a complete ledger. An auditor observes, collects cross-references, and builds an inescapable case. If Julian had gone to these lengths to hide a child and a mistress, this easy pass and this receipt were only the absolute edge of the deception. There had to be a house. There had to be an entire financial ecosystem funding this hidden life. Money does not just vanish, it leaves a trail. I carefully folded the dental receipt, memorizing the clinic name, the address, and the name Leo Lawson. I took out my phone and snapped a clear, high-resolution photo of both the receipt and the hidden transponder. Then with deliberate, steady hands, I placed the items exactly back where I found them. I closed the false compartment until it clicked shut perfectly. I found the missing tax document tucked inside the side door pocket. I took a deep breath, smoothed my hair in the rearview mirror, and stepped out of the car into the biting wind. Julian Sterling thought he had buried his lies securely. He had no idea that he had just handed the shovel to the woman who was going to bury him. Walking back into the house was the hardest performance of my entire life. The warm, recycled air of our foyer hit my face, but I felt nothing except the icy grip of adrenaline flooding my veins. I closed the heavy oak front door quietly behind me and took a slow, deliberate breath to steady my violently shaking hands. Julian was sitting on the living room sofa, perfectly relaxed. He had a heavy crystal glass of scotch in one hand and his glowing smartphone in the other. He looked up at me with that signature, easy, charismatic smile that had charmed me a decade ago. "Did you find it?" he asked. His voice was smooth, resonant, and completely devoid of any guilt. He was a masterclass in deception, a predator wearing a tailored suit. I forced the corners of my mouth to lift into a casual, convincing smile. I held up the mundane tax document and nodded. "Yes, I found it right where you left it, tucked into the side pocket." I kept my voice light and entirely unbothered. "Good," he said, taking a slow sip of his amber drink. "You work too hard, Harper. Come sit with me." I lied effortlessly and told him I needed to finish compiling the quarterly spreadsheets before my early morning department meeting. I kissed the top of his head as I walked past him, brushing my lips against his dark hair. He smelled like expensive sandalwood cologne, an absolute betrayal. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to confront him right then, to tear the perfect house apart, to demand answers about the name Leo Lawson. But an auditor knows better. You never ask a directly incriminating question until you already hold the absolute irrefutable proof in your hands. I walked down the long hardwood hallway to my home office and closed the solid door. I turned the brass lock with a soft, definitive click. I sat at my heavy mahogany desk and opened my laptop. The harsh blue light illuminated the dark, silent room. I did not cry. Crying is a luxury for women who have time to mourn, and I had none. I had a complex financial autopsy to perform. I started the investigation with the easiest thread available, the hidden toll pass. I pulled up our joint bank accounts, our shared credit cards, and our household expense ledgers. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in the 12-digit serial number of the hidden transponder device I had photographed in his car. I ran sophisticated search queries through 3 entire years of our personal financial history. I searched for the specific Connecticut pediatric dental clinic. I searched for random cash withdrawals matching $350. I searched for the surname Lawson. The banking system returned 0 results every single time. Nothing. Our personal finances were completely immaculate. Julian had covered his tracks perfectly in our shared domestic life. He knew I meticulously monitored our household spending, so he never let a single illicit dime cross our personal threshold. He thought this extreme caution made him untouchable, but he forgot exactly who he married. I am not just a naive wife who balances a monthly checkbook. I am a senior corporate auditor who unravels multi-million-dollar corporate frauds for breakfast. If the money was not coming from our personal banking accounts, it had to be bleeding out from somewhere else. And there was only one other place Julian had access to massive amounts of untethered liquid cash. His commercial real estate development firm. I opened a secure encrypted browser. As his wife and his informal strategic financial advisor, I had administrative access credentials to his company accounting ledgers. I had always implicitly trusted him to run the day-to-day financial operations of his business while I focused solely on the high-level annual tax strategy. That blind, unwavering trust ended tonight. I bypassed the standard visual dashboards and dove straight into the raw, unedited data. The general ledger, the external vendor payment histories, the outgoing wire transfers. I began a grueling forensic sweep of the past 6 years of his corporate life. I started looking for the telltale patterns that white-collar criminals always use to hide money. The duplicate invoice payments, the perfectly rounded numbers, the unverified third-party vendors. For the first 2 hours of my search, I found absolutely nothing but standard commercial construction costs, massive lumber invoices, exorbitant architecture fees, routine city permit payments. Julian was exceptionally careful. He was expertly blending his personal theft into the legitimate, massive financial chaos of commercial development projects. But every financial thief, no matter how smart, has a tell. His tell was consistency. It was just past 2 in the morning when my tired, burning eyes caught an anomaly. It was buried deep within the accounts payable records for a massive downtown luxury apartment complex project we had jointly funded 3 years ago. It was a recurring automatic monthly payment, exactly $4,800. The payee was listed simply as Apex Holdings, LLC. The expense category was vaguely labeled as Specialized Environmental Consulting Services. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. Specialized consulting is the oldest and most tired trick in the corporate fraud playbook. It is a financial black hole category specifically designed to swallow massive amounts of money without requiring any tangible physical receipts like concrete steel or drywall. I isolated the vendor name, Apex Holdings LLC. I ran a comprehensive database query across all of his active and closed development projects for the last 72 months. The screen instantly populated with hundreds of rows of structured data. The digital blood splattered vividly across my monitor. Julian had not just paid this mysterious company once. He had been paying Apex Holdings every single month for exactly 6 years. Sometimes it was the standard $4,800. Sometimes it was much larger lump sums, carefully disguised as quarterly retainer bonuses or project completion fees. $7,000 here, $12,000 there. My fingers went completely numb as I exported the raw data into a fresh, secure spreadsheet and ran a quick automated summation formula. The total extracted number flashed on the screen, and the breath violently left my lungs. Over $420,000. He had systematically siphoned nearly $500,000 out of his own company. And because I had personally co-signed the commercial loans and invested my own inherited family trust fund into his firm to help him start it, he had effectively been stealing directly from my future to do it. The crushing betrayal rapidly morphed into pure, cold, concentrated rage. He was not just cheating on me emotionally, he was robbing me blind financially. I absolutely needed to know exactly who or what Apex Holdings was. A quick digital search through the State Business Corporate Registry revealed the devastating truth. Apex Holdings was a ghost entity, a shell company. It had been officially incorporated exactly 6 years and 2 months ago, right around the exact time I was physically recovering from the traumatic late-term miscarriage. Right around the time little Leo Lawson would have been born into the world, the puzzle pieces were snapping together with sickening, perfect precision. The registered legal agent for the LLC was Julian Sterling. He was the sole listed proprietor. He was intentionally invoicing his own company for phantom ghost services and paying himself the stolen money into a hidden corporate bank account. It was textbook corporate embezzlement. It was highly illegal. And it was arrogant because he thought I would never lower myself to look at the mundane vendor level of his own daily operations. But every shell company legally needs a physical address to be officially registered with the state government. Criminals almost always try to use anonymous post office boxes or generic virtual office spaces in corporate parks. I aggressively clicked on the original incorporation documents to view the registered business address for Apex Holdings. I fully expected to see a generic commercial suite located downtown. Instead, the address listed was entirely residential. It was a picturesque street name I did not recognize in a zip code I had only ever seen printed on the pediatric dental receipt from the hidden glove box. It was in Connecticut. I opened a new browser tab and quickly typed the address into a premium real estate valuation database. The page loaded instantly. A high-resolution drone photograph filled my entire screen. It was not an office building. It was a breathtaking, sprawling 4-bedroom modern colonial home. It had pristine white siding, dramatic black shutters, and a perfectly manicured emerald green lawn. The current estimated property value was listed at $1.2 million. It was located in one of the absolute most exclusive and expensive public school districts in the entire state. I stared blankly at the bright photograph of the beautiful house. I stared at the expensive wooden play swing set clearly visible in the expansive fenced backyard. I stared at the wide paved driveway where a second luxury SUV could easily be parked. This was exactly where the stolen money was going. The recurring monthly payments of $4,800 perfectly matched the exact amount of a standard mortgage payment for $1 million home in that area. The larger, random lump sums were clearly for annual property taxes and seasonal maintenance. Julian had bought an entire secret house for his secret second family, using my money to subsidize their perfect, pristine suburban dream. The emotional conflict inside me immediately shifted from a dull, throbbing ache to a sharp, tactical, diamond-hard clarity. I was unknowingly funding the lavish life of the woman who was sleeping with my husband. I was literally paying for the heavy roof over the head of the child he claimed he was far too traumatized to have with me. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his ongoing crime was staggering to comprehend. I looked down at the digital clock on my computer screen. It was 3:30 in the morning. The house was completely silent. Julian was fast asleep down the hall, resting peacefully while my entire universe violently collapsed around me. He felt entirely safe. He felt completely secure, wrapped in his elaborate lies. I did not close the laptop. I saved absolutely everything. I meticulously backed up the financial ledgers, the forged incorporation documents, the fake consulting invoices, and the detailed property records onto a secure encrypted cloud drive that only I could ever access. I silently printed hard copies of the absolute most damning financial evidence and locked them tightly inside my personal hidden fireproof safe. By the time the first pale gray light of dawn began to creep slowly through the office window blinds, my tears had completely dried up. The initial shock was entirely gone. Only the seasoned auditor remained, and the auditor had a meticulous plan. I knew exactly what I had to do next. Raw financial data on a glowing screen was not enough for me anymore. Digital documents could be legally denied in court. Elaborate excuses could be manufactured by expensive lawyers. I desperately needed to see it with my own two eyes. I needed to look directly at the physical manifestation of his 6-year betrayal. I needed to see the actual woman who lived in the beautiful house I unknowingly paid for. The Connecticut address was exactly 40 miles away, a straightforward 45-minute drive on the empty morning highway. If I left right now, I could be there just as the suburban neighborhood woke up. I could sit hidden in my car and watch the house come alive. I could see the devastating truth breathing and walking in the morning daylight. I stood up from my heavy desk, my legs stiff but my internal resolve absolutely unbreakable. I grabbed my car keys and my heavy winter coat. I walked silently past our closed bedroom door without giving it even a single passing glance. The man sleeping comfortably in that bed was a complete stranger to me now. He was just a massive toxic liability on my balance sheet, and I was going to perfectly liquidate him. The drive from Chicago to that wealthy Connecticut suburb took exactly 47 minutes, but it felt like traversing an entirely different lifetime. The sun had not yet crested the horizon when I pulled onto the empty interstate. The world was cast in a cold, bruised purple light. I drove in absolute silence. I did not turn on the radio. I did not turn on the heater. I needed the freezing air blowing through the vents to keep me alert, to keep the suffocating weight of the night from crushing my chest. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. My mind was a chaotic storm of conflicting realities, fighting for dominance. One part of my brain, the desperate wife who had loved a man for 8 years, was pleading for a logical explanation. She was begging the universe to let this be a massive misunderstanding. Maybe Julian was just protecting a friend. Maybe Apex Holdings was a legitimate venture, and he was just terrible at bookkeeping. But the other part of my brain, the senior financial auditor who spent her life hunting discrepancies, knew the brutal, undeniable truth. Numbers do not lie. Shell companies do not exist by accident. And secret pediatric dental receipts paid in cash are never innocent. I merged onto the parkway, the tall skeletal winter trees blurring past my windows like prison bars. I was driving toward my own execution, but I pressed the accelerator harder anyway. I needed to see the blade fall. I crossed into the town limits just as the morning light began to turn a pale golden yellow. The neighborhood was everything the real estate database had promised, and worse. It was dripping with old money and quiet, pristine exclusivity. The streets were lined with centuries-old oak trees and sprawling estates hidden behind wrought iron gates and perfectly manicured hedges. There were no sidewalks here. It was a place designed specifically to keep outsiders out and secrets firmly locked in. I slowed my car down, creeping along the winding asphalt road, my eyes scanning the polished brass house numbers mounted on stone pillars. 34, 36, 38. And then I saw it, number 42. It looked exactly like the drone photograph on my computer screen, but seeing it in person was a physical blow. The massive colonial home sat back from the street, imposing and flawless with its brilliant white siding and dramatic black shutters. It radiated the kind of warm suburban perfection that Julian and I had once talked about building together before the miscarriage, before he told me he could not handle the pressure of a family. I drove past the house and parked my car 200 yards down the street, tucking my vehicle securely behind a large cluster of evergreen bushes. I turned off the engine. The sudden silence in the car was deafening. I rolled down my window just a fraction of an inch, letting the crisp morning air flood the cabin. And then I waited. I sat in the freezing cold for what felt like hours. Every passing minute chipped away at my sanity. A few expensive cars drove past, heading toward the city for early morning commutes. A woman in expensive athletic wear jogged by with a golden retriever, completely oblivious to the woman suffocating inside the parked car she just passed. My eyes never left the wide paved driveway of number 42. Then at exactly 7:15 in the morning, the heavy wooden front door swung open. My heart stopped beating entirely. The air vanished from my lungs. A little boy burst out of the house and sprinted down the front steps. He was wearing a bright red winter jacket and a small backpack. He was laughing, his breath making little white clouds in the cold air. It was Leo. He was real. He had Julian's exact dark hair and the same confident way of carrying himself even at 6 years old. A second later, a woman stepped out onto the porch, Maya. She was breathtakingly beautiful. She had long dark hair pulled back into a casual, elegant knot, and she wore a thick cashmere sweater that draped perfectly over her shoulders. She held a steaming mug of coffee in one hand, and she leaned against the white porch column, watching the boy run across the frosted grass. They looked like a scene ripped directly out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. They looked perfect. They looked expensive. And I was the one secretly paying for every single beautiful piece of it. I could not look away even as hot tears finally broke free and streamed down my frozen cheeks. I was watching the ghost of the life I was supposed to have, the life Julian had sworn he was too broken to build. But the absolute worst was yet to come. The low hum of a powerful engine broke the quiet morning air. A sleek black SUV identical to the one parked in my own driveway in Chicago turned slowly onto the street. It glided past my hiding spot and pulled directly into the driveway of number 42. My stomach violently revolted. Julian had told me he had an early morning construction site inspection downtown. He had kissed my forehead, told me he loved me, and walked out our front door to drive 40 miles in the opposite direction straight to his second family. I watched through my tear-blurred windshield as the driver's side door opened and Julian stepped out. He was wearing his expensive camel hair overcoat. He did not look burdened. He did not look like a man juggling a massive financial fraud and a double life. He looked completely relaxed and blissfully happy. Little Leo let out a shriek of joy and ran full speed across the driveway, throwing his arms around Julian's legs. Julian laughed a deep, genuine sound that I had not heard in our own home in years. He scooped the boy up, spinning him around before setting him down and ruffling his dark hair. Then Julian walked up the porch steps toward Maya. She smiled, setting her coffee mug on the railing. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close, and kissed her deeply on the mouth. It was not a rushed greeting. It was the familiar, intimate kiss of a couple who had shared a bed for years. It was the kiss of a husband returning to his real home. The emotional devastation that hit me in that exact moment is impossible to articulate. It was not just a broken heart. It was a complete psychological collapse. Every memory, every sacrifice, every long hour I had worked to support his dreams had been a magnificent, towering lie. I had spent 6 years mourning a family we never had while he was secretly building one with my money and another woman's body. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the palms of my hands fiercely against my temples, trying to block out the sickening image of them together on that perfect white porch. I wanted to start my car, slam my foot onto the gas pedal, and ram my vehicle straight through their front door. I wanted to scream until my throat bled. I wanted to burn the house to the ground and watch his perfect fake life turn to ash. The rage building inside me was hot and pure and completely blinding. I was shaking so violently that my teeth rattled together. I reached for the door handle, ready to step out into the freezing morning and detonate his world. I was going to walk up that driveway and introduce myself as the primary financial investor of their little suburban dream. But before my fingers could pull the latch, the sharp, piercing sound of my cell phone ringing shattered the quiet interior of my car. The sudden noise was so loud and so jarring that I physically jumped, slamming my elbow against the center console. I stared blindly at the phone sitting in the passenger seat. The screen was brightly lit, casting a harsh glow across the dark leather. The caller ID flashed a name that made my blood run entirely cold. Sarah, Julian's younger sister, my sister-in-law. For a fleeting second, I thought maybe Julian had somehow realized I was missing. Maybe he had panicked and told his family to look for me. But he was standing right there on the porch holding another woman. Why was Sarah calling me at 7:30 in the morning? I wiped the tears violently from my face, cleared my throat, and swiped the green button to answer. I pressed the phone to my ear, keeping my eyes fixed on the happy family down the street. Hello? I said, my voice surprisingly steady, though incredibly hollow. Harper, good morning, Sarah chirped. Her voice was bright, bubbly, and dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my skin immediately crawl. I'm so sorry to call you this early, but I knew you would be up working. You're always so dedicated. I am just finalizing the catering menu for Julian's 36th birthday gala next month, and I desperately need your opinion on the hors d'oeuvres. Should we do the crab cakes or the Wagyu sliders? Julian absolutely loves the crab, but I know you are allergic, so I wanted to check. I sat perfectly still, staring through the windshield. Down the driveway, Julian was helping Leo into the back seat of his SUV, buckling him in for the ride to school. Sarah was rambling on about floral arrangements and ice sculptures. She was eagerly planning a massive, expensive celebration to honor her wonderful, successful brother. The brother whose business I had saved. The brother whose life I managed. The brother who was currently kissing his mistress goodbye. And as I listened to the forced, cheerful cadence of Sarah's voice, a new, horrifying realization slowly washed over me. Sarah knew. The bright, fake tone, the forced inclusion, the specific mention of my allergy. It was all a carefully constructed performance. Over the past 6 years, I had noticed the slight whispers at family gatherings, the inside jokes. I was never part of the sudden silences when I walked into a room. I had always dismissed it as standard in-law friction. But right now, listening to her casually discuss party menus while her brother was 40 miles away, dropping his secret child at elementary school, the puzzle pieces shifted again. Julian could not have hidden an entire child from his own parents and his own sister for 6 years. They were too close. They spent every holiday together. The Sterling family was fiercely protective of their own. They did not just know about Maya and Leo. They had actively helped him hide them. They had sat at my dining table, eating the expensive Thanksgiving dinners I had cooked, smiling to my face while protecting the Golden Boy's dark secret. They had chosen his mistress and his secret son over the childless wife who simply paid their bills. The betrayal widened, fracturing the very foundation of my reality. I was not just fighting a cheating husband. I was entirely surrounded by enemies. An entire family of predators who viewed me as nothing more than an exploitable financial resource. The grief and the shock that had paralyzed me just moments ago instantly evaporated. It was entirely replaced by a terrifying, freezing calm. I am the auditor, and the auditor had just found the rest of the conspirators. I watched Julian's black SUV pull out of the driveway and head down the street in the opposite direction toward the elementary school. I took a slow, deep breath, completely steadying my heart rate. I do not care about the crab cake, Sarah, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly pleasant. Whatever Julian wants is fine with me. We want his birthday to be a night he will never, ever forget. I smiled into the empty car, a cold, vicious smile that did not reach my eyes. I hung up the phone and started the engine. The investigation was officially over. The execution had begun. The invitation to the weekly Sterling family dinner had been sitting on my calendar for days, but attending it tonight felt like walking voluntarily into a cage full of smiling predators. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror for 20 minutes just practicing how to breathe normally. I applied an extra layer of expensive concealer under my eyes to hide the devastating exhaustion of the morning. I wore a tailored emerald green dress that Julian always loved because tonight I needed to look completely untouchable. I needed to look like the oblivious wealthy wife they all relied upon. The drive to his parents' sprawling estate in the affluent suburb of Oak Brook was agonizing. Julian drove with one hand casually resting on my thigh. His touch, which used to make me feel so incredibly loved, now made my skin crawl with physical revulsion. He spent the entire 30-minute car ride complaining about the rising costs of commercial building materials. He spoke so passionately about his tight project budgets, while I sat there silently calculating exactly how much of that budget was actively paying for his secret child to attend a private Connecticut elementary school. I nodded at all the right intervals, offering small sounds of sympathetic agreement. The performance was exhausting, but the auditor inside me knew that maintaining the illusion of normalcy was my absolute greatest weapon. We pulled into the circular driveway of his parents' massive brick home. The house was brightly lit, radiating a false sense of warmth and family unity. As we walked through the heavy front doors, the rich smell of roasted garlic and expensive red wine filled the air. Julian's parents, Thomas and Victoria, greeted us with open arms. Victoria hugged me tightly, kissing my cheek, and telling me how beautiful I looked. Her voice was warm and maternal. Thomas clapped Julian on the shoulder, beaming with intense pride at his successful son. A few hours ago, I would have felt lucky to be part of this family. Now every smile felt like a physical threat. We moved into the formal dining room where the long mahogany table was perfectly set with fine crystal and polished silver. Julian's younger sister Sarah was already seated across the table. She was frantically typing on her phone, but looked up with a bright, artificial smile when we entered. Sitting quietly next to her was her husband Marcus. Marcus is a brilliant corporate litigator and the only person in this family who actually earned his own money. He is a tall, sharply dressed African-American man with incredibly observant eyes. He always seemed to exist slightly on the periphery of the Sterling family chaos, carefully watching their entitled behavior with a quiet, measured judgment. Tonight, he simply nodded at me as I took my seat next to Julian. The dinner service began. Victoria brought out a massive, perfectly cooked prime rib, and Thomas proudly poured generous glasses of an incredibly expensive Cabernet Sauvignon. I watched the dark red liquid fill my crystal glass and thought about the $420,000 Julian had stolen from me. I thought about the fact that the very wine they were drinking, the very house they were sitting in, had been heavily subsidized by my personal financial investments in Julian Company. They were literally feasting on my money. The conversation flowed easily around me. Julian was holding court, telling an embellished story about a difficult city zoning board meeting. He played the role of the hardworking, stressed developer flawlessly. His parents hung on his every word, offering sympathetic murmurs. Then Sarah leaned forward, adjusting her diamond necklace, and smoothly shifted the topic. She excitedly announced that she had finally secured the downtown botanical gardens for Julian, massive 36th birthday gala. She rambled on about the exorbitant costs of the floral arrangements and the imported champagne tower. She looked directly at me, her eyes wide and perfectly innocent, as she asked if I thought we should upgrade to the premium seafood station. I looked around the table at the faces of my supposed family. I thought about Maya standing on the white porch. I thought about little Leo running across the frost-covered grass, and I decided it was time to test the structural integrity of their lies. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, carefully lowering the glass back to the table. I kept my voice perfectly light, conversational, and entirely unbothered. I told Sarah that the seafood station sounded wonderful, but we might need to tighten the gala budget just a little bit this year. The entire table paused. Julian looked at me with a slight frown of genuine confusion. He asked me why we would need to cut back when his company was having a record-breaking quarter. I turned to look directly into my husband's eyes, maintaining a warm, supportive smile. I told him that I had been doing some preliminary tax prep work that morning and noticed a significant increase in his external vendor expenditures. I casually mentioned that his environmental consulting costs had skyrocketed. I picked up my silver fork and traced the edge of my porcelain plate. I said the name with absolute chilling precision. I told him I was specifically looking at the monthly invoices from a company called Apex Holdings. I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact with Julian. I simply dropped the bomb into the center of the dining table and waited for the shockwave. The physical reaction was instantaneous and entirely devastating. Julian's entire body violently flinched. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly grayish white. His jaw clamped shut, and the confident, charismatic smile vanished completely. He stared at me in absolute terror, like a man who had just stepped on a landmine in his own living room. But Julian's reaction was not the one that shattered my world. Across the table, Sarah let out a sharp, audible gasp. Her hand jerked violently, hitting the base of her crystal wine glass. The heavy glass tipped over instantly. The expensive dark red Cabernet poured rapidly across the pristine white linen tablecloth, looking exactly like spreading blood. The thick red stain rushed toward the centerpieces, completely ruining the perfect table setting. Sarah's face was completely paralyzed with panic. She scrambled backward, pushing her heavy wooden chair violently against the hardwood floor. She grabbed a cloth napkin and began frantically dabbing at the massive red stain, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the fabric. She was not apologizing for the spill. She was breathing heavily, her eyes darting wildly between me and Julian. Thomas and Victoria completely froze. Neither of them moved to help clean up the spill. Victoria stared directly at her plate, her hands tightly gripped in her lap. Thomas suddenly found his water glass incredibly fascinating, refusing to look anywhere near my face. The absolute silence in the dining room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Sarah frantic scraping against the wet table. It was the most profound, terrifying silence I had ever experienced. In that single microscopic fraction of a second, the entire agonizing truth materialized right before my eyes. They all knew, every single one of them. My husband had not hidden his mistress and his secret child from his family. He had only hidden them from me. His parents knew about Maya. Sarah knew about Leo. They had all actively participated in the deception. They had sat around this exact table, laughing with me, celebrating holidays with me, accepting the expensive gifts I bought them all, while knowing that 40 miles away, another woman was raising Julian's son in a house funded by my stolen money. The sheer magnitude of their collective betrayal hit me with the force of a freight train. They viewed me as nothing more than a blind, compliant bank account. I was the financial foundation that allowed their golden boy to live his perfect double life. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but I forced my face to remain completely passive. I leaned back in my chair, watching the chaotic panic unfold before me. I told Sarah not to worry about the stain. I kept my voice incredibly soft. I told her I would go to the kitchen to get some club soda and salt to lift the red wine. I stood up from the table, slowly smoothing the front of my emerald dress. Julian tried to grab my wrist, his fingers cold and clammy, but I effortlessly slipped out of his grasp and walked away. I pushed through the heavy wooden swinging door into the massive gourmet kitchen. The bright fluorescent lights hummed above the marble countertops. A few seconds later, the door swung open again and Sarah stumbled into the kitchen. She looked like she was about to vomit. Her perfect makeup was slightly smudged and her chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. She rushed toward the deep stainless steel sink, grabbing a handful of paper towels. I did not move toward the club soda. I stepped directly into her path, blocking her exit. I closed the distance between us until I was standing only inches away from her trembling frame. The polite sister-in-law act was completely dead. I looked down at her, and my voice was a cold, razor-sharp whisper. I asked her exactly how long she had known about the house in Connecticut. Sarah's eyes widened in absolute sheer terror. She backed up until her spine hit the edge of the cold granite island. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just let out a pathetic whimpering sound. She tried to shake her head to deny it, to feign ignorance, but she was a terrible actress and an even worse liar. Her silence was a total confession. I leaned closer, my eyes locking onto hers. I asked her if she enjoyed helping her brother steal my money to play house with Maya, while she sat at my dining table, eating the food I paid for. A massive sob tore from Sarah's throat. She covered her face with her shaking hands, completely unable to look at me. The cowardice was absolutely pathetic. She pushed violently past me, knocking her shoulder hard against my arm, and sprinted out of the kitchen through the back hallway door, fleeing the confrontation entirely. I stood alone in the bright kitchen, my fists clenched, so tightly my fingernails bit deeply into my palms. I closed my eyes, trying to rein in the explosive fury radiating through my entire body. I needed to get back to the dining room. I needed to finish the performance. But as I turned toward the swinging door, a shadow detached itself from the darkened hallway pantry. My breath hitched as Marcus stepped fully into the harsh kitchen light. I had no idea he had followed his wife. I had no idea how long he had been standing there. He looked at me, his dark eyes completely unreadable, his face set in a hard, serious mask. He slowly crossed his arms over his broad chest. He did not look angry. He looked like a litigator who had just found the star witness for the most important trial of his entire career. He looked right at me and nodded slowly. The morning after the disastrous family dinner, I arrived at my downtown auditing firm, before the sun even fully cleared the skyline. I sat in my glass office, staring at the blinking cursor on my computer screen. My mind was still trapped in the Sterling family kitchen, replaying the pathetic, terrified look on Sarah's face. I had not slept a single minute. Julian had tried to ask me what happened when we got home, but I simply locked the guest bedroom door and ignored his frantic knocking. At exactly 9:15, my desk phone rang. It was not an internal extension. I picked up the receiver and heard a deep, calm voice on the other end. It was Marcus. He did not say hello. He simply told me to meet him at an independent coffee shop in the financial district exactly 4 blocks away from my office. He told me to leave my cell phone inside my desk drawer. The level of operational security he was demanding sent a fresh spike of adrenaline straight through my veins. I did not ask any questions. I walked out of my building, leaving my phone exactly where he told me to, and navigated the bustling morning sidewalks. The coffee shop was dimly lit and entirely filled with corporate lawyers and investment bankers conducting quiet morning meetings. I spotted Marcus sitting in a secluded corner booth, perfectly positioned so he could see the front door. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, his briefcase resting on the table in front of him. I slid into the booth across from him. He did not offer a polite greeting or a sympathetic smile. He pushed a plain manila folder across the smooth wooden table toward me. I opened it carefully. Inside was a printed copy of the exact same property deed for the Connecticut house I had found on the state registry database the night before. I looked up at him, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. I asked him how long he had known about the house and the boy. Marcus leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He told me he only found out exactly 2 weeks ago. He explained that Thomas had asked him to casually review a preliminary commercial contract for Julian real estate firm. While Marcus was reviewing the standard liability clauses, he noticed a massive glaring discrepancy in the external vendor disbursements. The exact same Apex Holdings anomaly I had found. Marcus said he confronted Julian directly about the shell company, assuming it was just sloppy tax evasion. But Julian panicked. Under the pressure of a seasoned corporate litigator, Julian completely cracked and confessed everything to him. He told Marcus about Maya. He told him about the 6-year-old boy named Leo. He told him how his parents and Sarah had been helping him cover it up since the very beginning. Marcus' voice remained incredibly low and steady, but I could see the absolute disgust burning in his dark eyes. He told me he went straight home and confronted Sarah that same night. He demanded to know how she could possibly look me in the eye every single week. Knowing her brother was stealing my money to fund a secret family, Sarah cried and tried to justify it. She told Marcus that Julian was just unhappy and that the Sterling family had to protect their own. She actually tried to convince Marcus that it was none of their business. Marcus looked at me across the small table and shook his head slowly. He told me he had packed his bags that very night and moved into a long-term luxury hotel downtown. He had not slept in the same bed as Sarah for 14 days. He completely refused to be complicit in their toxic web of lies. I sat there listening to him, and for the first time in 48 hours, the crushing weight of total isolation began to lift off my shoulders. I was not entirely alone in the dark. Marcus understood the exact magnitude of the betrayal because he was intimately familiar with the poisonous dynamic of the Sterling family. He took a slow sip of his black coffee and leaned back against the leather booth. He told me that he recognized the specific type of dismissive abuse they were inflicting on me because it was the exact same way they had treated him for years. Marcus is a brilliant African-American man who pulled himself out of a working-class neighborhood in Detroit to graduate at the absolute top of his class at Harvard Law. He built his own massive wealth and flawless reputation completely from scratch. But to Thomas and Victoria Sterling, he was never quite good enough for their daughter. Marcus explained how Julian parents had always looked down on him, masking their deep-rooted racism and classism behind polite condescending smiles and passive-aggressive comments at holiday dinners. They constantly reminded him how lucky he was to be welcomed into their prestigious, wealthy white family. They treated his incredible professional success as a lucky anomaly rather than the result of his own brilliant mind. He told me how Thomas once introduced him at a country club event as Sarah's husband, the aggressive lawyer, rather than using his actual name. They demanded his absolute loyalty and expected him to be entirely grateful for their basic tolerance. He looked directly into my eyes and told me he saw them doing the exact same thing to me. They viewed me as nothing more than a highly functional appliance. I was the reliable, wealthy workhorse who subsidized their son's luxurious lifestyle. They gladly took my money, they ate my food, and they used my flawless credit score to elevate their own social standing. But the moment I was no longer in the room, they discarded my humanity entirely. They believed their son was inherently entitled to have his perfect wife paying the bills while simultaneously keeping his beautiful mistress in a $1 million suburban home. Marcus told me that the Sterling family operated on a fundamental belief that people like him and people like me existed solely to serve their needs. The raw honesty in his voice was incredibly validating. I had spent years trying to earn the genuine love and respect of Thomas and Victoria. I had bought them extravagant anniversary gifts. I had hosted every single major holiday. I had convinced myself that their subtle coldness was just my own insecurity. Hearing Marcus clearly articulate the exact parasitic nature of their family dynamic finally shattered the last remaining illusion I held. They did not just betray me, they consumed me, and they felt absolutely justified in doing it. Marcus reached across the table and tapped his long index finger directly on the manila folder. He told me that when he saw me sitting at that dining room table last night, casually dropping the name Apex Holdings, he knew exactly what I was doing. He saw the cold, calculated way I dismantled the room. He knew I had already found the digital paper trail. He told me he was incredibly impressed by my restraint. Any other woman would have screamed and thrown glasses and demanded a divorce right then and there. But I played the long game. I gathered the intelligence and I tested their defenses. Then Marcus leaned in, incredibly close, his voice dropping to a dangerous, focused whisper. He told me that I could easily file for a standard divorce. I could hire a regular family lawyer, split the assets, and walk away with half of what was left. He said that was exactly what Julian and his parents would expect me to do. They would drag out the court proceedings, they would hide the remaining cash, and they would exhaust me financially until I settled for a fraction of what I deserved. But Marcus did not want me to do that. He told me he wanted to offer me a completely different option. He offered to be my legal sniper. He told me that his corporate litigation firm specialized in dismantling massive fraudulent financial structures. He knew exactly how Julian Company was legally structured because he had reviewed the contracts himself. He knew where every single vulnerable pressure point was located. He told me we were not going to fight Julian in family court over alimony and furniture. We were going to fight him in corporate court over gross financial embezzlement and systematic fraud. Marcus laid out his preliminary strategy right there in the coffee shop. He explained that because Julian had illegally commingled our marital trust funds to purchase the Connecticut house through his shell company, we could technically seize the property. We could quietly attach a forensic lien to his entire development firm before he even realized he was being audited. Marcus told me that we could financially decapitate Julian so quickly and so ruthlessly that his parents would not even have time to drain their own retirement accounts to save him. I looked at this brilliant man sitting across from me. He was risking his own complex marriage to Sarah to help me destroy her brother. I asked him directly why he was willing to go to such extreme lengths for me. Marcus did not hesitate. He told me that he was filing for divorce from Sarah by the end of the month anyway. He refused to raise children in a family that protected predators and normalized deception. He said he was going to burn his bridge with the Sterling family, and he wanted to hand me the match so I could burn mine at the exact same time. I placed my hands flat on top of the manila folder, feeling the thick paper beneath my palms. The fear and the devastating heartbreak that had paralyzed me just 24 hours ago were completely gone. I was sitting across from one of the most ruthless and intelligent corporate litigators in the entire city, and he was handing me a fully loaded weapon. I looked at Marcus and I gave him a slow, steady nod. I told him I did not just want my money back. I told him I wanted Julian to lose absolutely everything he had built using my name. I wanted the mistress to realize she was sleeping with a broke fraud. I wanted the parents to watch their golden boy publicly collapse. Marcus smiled for the very first time since sitting down. It was a cold, sharp, predatory smile. He told me we had a massive amount of work to do. Marcus stood up from the small table in the coffee shop and told me to gather my things. He said we could not do this kind of high-level forensic legal work in a public place where anyone from Julian Company might accidentally see us. He led me out onto the busy downtown sidewalk, and we walked 3 blocks in absolute silence until we reached the towering glass skyscraper that housed his elite corporate litigation firm. We bypassed the main reception desk and took a private secure elevator directly to the 42nd floor. Marcus scanned his keycard and ushered me into a massive corner conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city of Chicago. He locked the heavy oak door behind us and closed the automated privacy blinds, completely sealing us off from the outside world. He walked over to a massive mahogany boardroom table and placed his briefcase on the polished surface. He popped the latches and began pulling out thick stacks of financial documents, legal contracts, and printed email threads. He told me to sit down and open my laptop. He said it was time to take off the mask of the heartbroken wife and put on the armor of the senior financial auditor. He told me we were going to trace every single dime Julian had ever stolen, and we were going to build an inescapable legal cage around him. I sat at the massive table and connected my laptop to the secure encrypted network Marcus provided. I opened the digital ledger files I had meticulously copied from Julian's home office computer the night before. I projected my screen onto the large monitor mounted on the conference room wall so Marcus could see exactly what I was looking at. We began the grueling process of cross-referencing his legal contracts with my raw financial data. We started with Apex Holdings. I pulled up the massive spreadsheet containing the 6 years of recurring monthly payments and random lump sum wire transfers. I sorted the data by date and by specific project allocation. I wanted to see exactly which commercial real estate developments Julian was using to camouflage his theft. I assumed he was simply skimming a small percentage of the top-line revenue from his very successful apartment complexes and retail centers. I assumed he was stealing his own operational profit. But as my eyes scanned the routing numbers and the specific origin accounts, a cold, terrible sense of dread began to pool in the bottom of my stomach. The numbers were not coming from his general operating accounts. They were not coming from his net profit margins. I highlighted a series of massive wire transfers from exactly 4 years ago. Each transfer was for exactly $15,000. They were all routed through a secondary escrow account, tied to a massive downtown commercial build called the Riverfront Plaza. I stared at the name of the project, and my hands physically stopped typing. The Riverfront Plaza was not just another one of Julian's business ventures. It was his flagship project. It was the massive commercial development that had officially put his firm on the map and elevated him into the upper echelon of the Chicago real estate elite. But Julian had not secured the initial funding for that project through a traditional commercial bank loan. He had come to me. 4 years ago, he had sat on our living room couch holding my hands and told me that the banks were demanding too much equity. He told me that if he could just get a massive initial cash injection, he could secure the land rights and build his empire. He had begged me to unlock my family trust fund. My grandfather had spent his entire life building a successful manufacturing company in the Midwest. When he passed away, he left a substantial trust fund in my name. It was supposed to be my absolute safety net. It was supposed to be the foundational wealth for the children Julian and I were going to have. But because I loved him, and because I implicitly trusted my husband as my life partner, I had agreed to help him. I had legally authorized the transfer of $2.5 million from my inherited trust fund directly into his commercial escrow accounts to serve as the seed money and the primary collateral for the Riverfront Plaza project. I had literally handed him my family legacy to build his dream. I rapidly clicked through the digital ledgers, tracing the specific origin codes of the $15,000 wire transfers. My breath caught in my throat. I ran the search query again, praying to whatever God was listening that I had simply made a minor clerical error. But the system returned the exact same undeniable result. The money Julian had used to purchase the $1.2 million house in Connecticut for his mistress did not come from his business profits. It came directly from the secondary escrow account holding my trust fund. Julian had taken the money my deceased grandfather had left for my future, and he had used it to secretly buy a sprawling suburban home for Maya and Leo. He had quite literally stolen my dead family money to build a comfortable, perfect life for his new secret family. The emotional betrayal I had felt sitting in my car outside that house that morning was entirely eclipsed by a blinding, violent rage. This was no longer just a story about a cheating husband. This was an incredibly calculated, predatory financial crime. He had manipulated my love, my grief over our miscarriage, and my unwavering loyalty to completely drain my most valuable financial asset. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew the trust fund money was legally commingled the second it hit his commercial escrow account, giving him the administrative ability to route it outward under the guise of legitimate vendor payments to his shell company. He had exploited my trust in his business acumen to rob me completely blind. I pushed my chair back from the table, my chest heaving as I tried to pull oxygen into my lungs. I looked at Marcus, who was staring intently at the projected screen on the wall. He had followed my digital cursor. He saw exactly what I had just uncovered. Marcus slowly took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked across the table at me, and his voice was incredibly grim. He told me that this changed absolutely everything. He said that this was no longer a simple case of marital asset division. This was massive high-stakes financial fraud. But the terrifying reality of the situation was actually far worse than just the stolen money. Marcus walked over to the projection screen and pointed directly at the current active balance of the Riverfront Plaza project. He asked me to pull up the current commercial loan covenants and the active debt obligations Julian had with his primary corporate lenders. My hands shook as I typed the commands, accessing the deepest layers of his corporate liability files. The data populated on the screen in stark black and white. Because Julian had been systematically siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the project funds for 6 years to pay for Maya House her car, and Leo private school tuition, the Riverfront Plaza project was completely bleeding out. He had masked the massive cash flow shortage by taking out predatory high-interest mezzanine loans just to cover the daily construction costs. He was desperately moving money around like a massive corporate shell game, trying to keep the massive project afloat while secretly funding his expensive double life. Marcus looked at me, his dark eyes completely serious. He explained the brutal legal reality of my situation. He told me that because I had originally supplied the $2.5 million from my trust as the primary collateral for the project, I was legally bound by a cross-collateralization clause. I had co-signed the master development agreement. Marcus' voice was completely calm, but the words he spoke were absolutely terrifying. He told me that Julian was currently less than 60 days away from a massive, catastrophic corporate default. The Riverfront Plaza project was going to run completely out of cash because Julian had stolen it all. And when the project inevitably defaulted, the commercial banks were not just going to seize Julian's company. They were going to trigger the personal guarantee clauses. They were going to come directly after me. The banks would legally seize the entire remaining balance of my grandfather's trust fund. They would put a massive lien on my personal income. They would completely destroy my flawless credit score. And they could even force the sale of the home I was currently living in. Julian's reckless, arrogant greed was not just going to ruin his own life. It was going to completely obliterate my entire financial existence. He had tied me to the tracks of a speeding freight train, and he was standing safely on the sidelines, holding the hand of his mistress. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. I looked at the staggering numbers on the screen, realizing just how incredibly close I was to total, absolute ruin. I looked at Marcus and told him that I needed to file for divorce immediately. I told him I needed to legally sever myself from Julian before the banks realized the project was functionally bankrupt. I told him I needed to freeze the accounts and run. Marcus slammed his hand flat down on the mahogany table. The sudden loud noise echoed sharply in the quiet room. He leaned over the table, looking directly down at me. He told me that filing for divorce right now was the absolute worst thing I could possibly do. He explained that the second I filed traditional divorce papers, Julian would be legally notified. He would immediately realize that the entire facade was collapsing. He would completely panic. And a panicked white-collar criminal with administrative access to international wire transfers is the most dangerous entity on the planet. Marcus told me that if Julian knew I was leaving him, he would immediately liquidate whatever cash was left in the operating accounts. He would transfer the Connecticut house entirely into my name to hide the asset, and he would let the commercial project instantly default just to spite me. He would burn the entire financial structure to the ground and leave me holding the massive smoking crater of debt. Marcus told me that I could not just divorce Julian. I could not just walk away and hope the legal system would protect me. The family court system moves far too slowly, and Julian had a 6-year head start on hiding the assets. Marcus said that if I wanted to survive this with my trust fund, my credit and my dignity intact, I had to destroy him from the inside. I had to completely decapitate him financially before he even realized there was a sword swinging at his neck. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, letting the absolute gravity of Marcus' words wash over me. The heartbroken wife who had cried in the car that morning was completely and permanently dead. She had been completely burned away by the sheer magnitude of the financial violence Julian had committed against me. I was a senior financial auditor. My entire professional career was built on finding the hidden truth and holding corrupt entities completely accountable. Julian thought I was just a naive domestic appliance. He thought my money was his money. He thought he could leverage my dead family legacy to build a suburban dream house for his mistress. He was about to find out exactly what happens when you attempt to defraud an apex predator in her own natural environment. I looked up at Marcus. The panic was completely gone from my chest. My heart rate was slow and steady. My mind was operating with terrifying crystal clarity. I told Marcus that I understood. I told him I would not file for divorce. I would go home tonight and I would cook Julian dinner. I would smile and I would ask him how his stressful day at the construction site went. I would help Sarah plan his massive, ridiculous 36th birthday gala. I would play the role of the perfect, supportive, oblivious wife flawlessly. I asked Marcus exactly how we were going to take the entire company away from him. I asked him how we were going to get the Connecticut house back. Marcus smiled that cold, predatory litigator smile. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a fresh stack of blank legal documents. He told me that Julian had a massive ego and an incredibly short attention span for tedious administrative paperwork. He told me we were going to use Julian's own arrogance completely against him. We were going to build a legal Trojan horse, and we were going to make Julian willingly sign his own absolute execution warrant. I pulled my laptop closer to me, resting my fingers lightly on the keyboard. I told Marcus to walk me through the exact legal maneuver. The trap was officially being set. The drive home from Marcus' office was a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. I had to take the brilliant, ruthless legal strategy we had just constructed and bury it deep beneath the surface of my skin. I pulled my car into our pristine driveway, right next to Julian Black's SUV. The same SUV with the false compartment. The same SUV he used to drive to Connecticut. I sat in the driver's seat for 5 full minutes just staring at the leather steering wheel, practicing my breathing. In through the nose and out through the mouth. I had to walk into that house and look directly into the eyes of a man who was actively destroying my life, and I had to smile. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the warm foyer. Julian was in the custom kitchen pouring a glass of expensive sparkling water. He was wearing his grey cashmere sweatpants, looking effortlessly handsome and completely innocent. He smiled broadly when he saw me and asked how my day was. The sound of his smooth voice sent a shockwave of pure physical revulsion straight down my spine. I forced my facial muscles to soften into a practiced mask. I dropped my keys into the silver bowl by the door and told him my day was incredibly exhausting. I told him tax season was absolutely crushing my entire auditing department. He walked over and kissed my forehead, wrapping his strong arm casually around my waist. He smelled exactly like sandalwood and lies. Every single survival instinct in my body screamed at me to shove him away, to scream the name Maya directly into his face until his perfect expression shattered. But I remembered Marcus' severe warning. I remembered the $2.5 million. So I leaned into his touch. I closed my eyes and I played the role of the tired, devoted wife. That night was the absolute closest I have ever come to completely losing my mind. We went up to our master bedroom, the beautiful room we had meticulously decorated together. I went into the master bathroom and stood under the scalding hot shower water until my skin turned entirely red, trying desperately to scrub the feeling of his hands off my waist. When I finally walked back into the bedroom, he was already under the heavy, expensive duvet, casually reading a commercial real estate magazine. I climbed into the bed, pulling the soft covers up to my chin. Julian turned off his brass bedside lamp and reached across the mattress. He pulled me against his chest, wrapping his arms tightly around me. He kissed the back of my neck and softly murmured that he loved me. I lay perfectly still in the overwhelming darkness, staring blindly at the far wall. My heart was pounding so violently in my own ears, I was terrified he would hear it echoing in the quiet room. Lying next to him felt exactly like being locked inside a dark cage with a venomous snake. I had to consciously force my breathing to slow down, matching his deep, steady sleeping rhythm. I had to pretend to fall asleep while my mind raced with complex forensic accounting formulas and aggressive corporate lean strategies. He fell asleep within 10 minutes, entirely unbothered by the massive financial crimes he was committing against me. He slept with the deep, peaceful breathing of a man who believed he was an absolute untouchable god in his own universe. I lay awake for 6 straight hours, staring into the pitch-black room, meticulously planning his complete and total destruction. Over the next week, my life became an exhausting, dangerous high-wire act of pure deception. During the day, I went to my auditing firm and did my actual demanding job. But the absolute second I got home, the real work began. I told Julian that my firm was handling a massive emergency audit for a new global corporate client and that I had to bring heavy workloads home every single night. I retreated to my home office immediately after dinner, locking the heavy door firmly behind me. I sat at my large mahogany desk for hours, secretly communicating with Marcus through a highly secure encrypted email server. We were drafting the exact legal documents we needed to execute the trap perfectly. We were preparing the forensic liens, the quiet title actions, and the corporate asset transfer agreements. But on my primary massive computer monitor, I always kept a complex, legitimate tax spreadsheet open, just in case Julian managed to walk in. The mental strain of maintaining this double life was immense. I was drinking 4 large cups of black coffee a day and surviving on barely 3 hours of broken sleep. The dark, heavy circles under my eyes were entirely real. My physical exhaustion was completely authentic, and because I was genuinely exhausted, I stopped engaging in our normal evening domestic banter. I stopped asking him about his day at the construction sites. I stopped pouring him his evening glass of expensive scotch. I was entirely consumed by the legal sniper operation I was quietly running from my locked office. Julian was a predator, and predators are incredibly sensitive to tiny shifts in their immediate environment. He started noticing the change in my energy. He noticed that I was no longer hovering around him acting like the adoring, constantly supportive wife. He noticed the locked office door every single evening. He noticed the late nights and the early mornings. But because he was a massive narcissist who believed he was the absolute center of the universe, he did not suspect for a single second that I had discovered his dark secret. Instead, he began to twist the narrative entirely to make himself the victim. His growing paranoia began to manifest as aggressive psychological gaslighting. It started with small passive-aggressive comments at the dinner table. He would look at my phone and ask if I was checking useless work emails again. He would sigh loudly and dramatically when I said I needed to go back to my office after dinner. He would leave passive-aggressive sticky notes on the kitchen coffee maker, complaining that we never spent any quality time together anymore. He was actively maintaining a secret mistress and a 6-year-old child 40 miles away, but he had the breathtaking audacity to feel neglected by me. The sheer hypocrisy of his behavior was so massive, it was almost suffocating. He wanted me to provide the stable, wealthy foundation of his domestic life while simultaneously demanding my constant, undivided emotional validation. The simmering tension finally snapped on a late Thursday night. It was past midnight, and I was deep into reviewing a complex corporate liability clause Marcus had just sent over. Suddenly, the brass doorknob to my office turned sharply. I had foolishly forgotten to lock it. Julian pushed the heavy door open and walked right in. He was wearing his dark silk pajamas, his arms crossed firmly and defensively over his chest. I immediately hit a designated hotkey, completely hiding the encrypted email server and pulling up the massive fake tax spreadsheet to fill the screen. I looked up at him, slowly rubbing my tired eyes. I asked him what was wrong. He stood in the dead center of my office, looking down at me with an expression of intense, righteous anger. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not ask if I needed any help with my stressful project. He immediately went on the vicious offensive. He told me that my recent behavior was completely unacceptable. He said I was entirely obsessed with work and that I was becoming completely emotionally distant. His smooth voice was rising, filling the small room with heavily misplaced indignation. He told me that he was out there every single day building a massive empire for our future, and that he came home to a wife who acted like a cold, unfeeling corporate roommate. He said I was actively neglecting our marriage. He said I was making him feel completely unloved and entirely unsupported in his own beautiful home. I sat there quietly listening to the man who had stolen $2.5 million from my deceased grandfather trust fund accuse me of being unsupportive. I listened to the man who was currently paying the property taxes for his mistress' suburban colonial home tell me that I was actively neglecting our marriage. The sheer terrifying scale of his gaslighting was a marvel of domestic psychological abuse. He was expertly projecting his own massive guilt and his own severe emotional distance entirely onto me. He was actively trying to make me feel terrible, so I would immediately overcompensate and give him even more control over my life. He stepped closer to my desk, leaning his heavy hands on the edge of the polished mahogany wood. He looked deeply into my eyes and delivered his final, devastating, manipulative blow. He lowered his voice, playing the part of the deeply wounded husband absolutely flawlessly. He told me that sometimes he really wondered if I even cared about our relationship anymore. He said that if I kept pushing him away like this, he honestly did not know how much longer he could tolerate being in such a cold, loveless environment. It was a thinly veiled threat. He was openly threatening to leave me because I was working too hard. He was using the very exhausting work that secretly funded his entire hidden life as a weapon to control me. The pure rage inside my chest was a towering, silent inferno. I wanted to stand up, grab my heavy laptop, and smash it directly into his perfectly handsome face. I wanted to scream the name Maya until my vocal cords gave out. I wanted to show him the encrypted emails from his brilliant brother-in-law Marcus and watch his arrogant expression completely disintegrate into pure panic. But I looked at the fake spreadsheet glowing on my screen. I remembered the elaborate trap. I remembered the ultimate goal of total financial destruction. I took a deep, shaky breath, forcing hot tears to well up in my eyes. I am not a trained actress, but the sheer overwhelming exhaustion of the past week made the tears flow effortlessly down my cheeks. I looked up at him, my voice trembling slightly. I told him he was absolutely right. I told him I was so incredibly sorry. I fed him exactly what his massive, fragile ego desperately needed to hear. I told him that I had been completely overwhelmed by the complex tax audits at the firm and that I had unfairly taken my massive stress out on him. I reached across the wide desk and placed my shaking hand gently over his. His skin was warm, and I had to suppress a violent physical shudder. I told him that he was the absolute most important thing in my entire world. I told him I saw exactly how hard he was working on the Riverfront Plaza project, and that I was just trying to secure my own career so I could be the strong, successful partner he truly deserved. I leaned into the overworked wife trope completely. I made myself look incredibly small. I made myself look vulnerable. I made myself exactly what he needed me to be so he would stop looking closely at my daily actions. Julian's tense posture instantly relaxed. The righteous anger melted away completely, replaced by a smug, satisfied, patronizing warmth. He had successfully manipulated his wife into apologizing for his own massive crimes. He walked around the heavy desk and pulled me gently out of my leather chair, wrapping his arms securely around me. He kissed the top of my head, resting his chin on my hair. He told me he forgave me. He said he just missed his beautiful, loving wife and he wanted us to be a solid team again. I rested my cheek against his silk pajamas, keeping my eyes completely open and perfectly cold in the dimly lit room. I told him we were a great team. I promised him that after this massive project was finally finished at work, I would dedicate all my free time entirely to him. I told him that his upcoming 36th birthday gala was going to be the absolute turning point for our marriage. I promised him a massive celebration he would remember for the rest of his natural life. Julian smiled, warmly kissing my forehead one last time before softly telling me not to work too much later. He walked out of my home office, closing the heavy door softly behind him. The absolute second the brass latch clicked shut, I locked the door and pulled the encrypted server back up on my bright screen. Julian was completely pacified. His massive ego was fed, and his dangerous suspicions were entirely gone. He went back to sleep feeling entirely secure in his perfect double life. He had absolutely no idea that my tearful apology was just the final heavy nail in his coffin. The illusion of normalcy was perfectly restored, and the legal guillotine was finally ready to drop. The morning after my desperate, tearful performance in the home office, I received a highly encrypted message from Marcus. He instructed me to meet him at an exclusive private members club located deep in the financial district. I arrived exactly on time and was escorted to a private soundproof meeting room lined with heavy mahogany bookshelves. Marcus was already sitting at the massive conference table. He looked incredibly sharp and completely focused. Spread out across the polished wood were the original foundational documents of my grandfather's massive family trust fund. I sat down across from him and took a slow, steady breath. Marcus did not waste a single second with pleasantries. He immediately began detailing the exact legal mechanism we were going to use to completely trap Julian. My grandfather had been an incredibly brilliant and incredibly paranoid businessman. When he established my trust fund, he wrapped the capital in layers of ironclad legal protection designed specifically to protect me from predatory financial partners. Marcus had spent the entire weekend meticulously combing through hundreds of pages of complex legalese. And he had found the absolute perfect weapon. It was a deeply buried stipulation regarding the fraudulent misuse of commingled marital funds. Marcus explained the beautiful and brutal reality of corporate law. Because Julian had routed the massive $2.5 million seed money from my protected trust through his primary commercial escrow accounts before actively siphoning it off to his shell company Apex Holdings, he had legally polluted the entire financial stream. He had made a catastrophic administrative error. By using that specific polluted money to purchase the $1.2 million house in Connecticut for his mistress, Julian had inadvertently tied the legal deed of that property directly back to my family trust. Marcus looked at me with cold, dark eyes and explained the concept of a constructive trust. If a husband secretly uses stolen marital assets to purchase real estate for a third party, the defrauded wife maintains a direct, equitable legal interest in that specific property. The mistress does not own it. The husband does not own it. The defrauded wife owns it. And Marcus was preparing to absolutely weaponize this legal reality. Over the next 48 hours, Marcus and his elite team of ruthless corporate litigators moved with absolute lethal precision. They operated entirely in the digital shadows, using their massive resources to execute the strike. They immediately drafted a comprehensive quiet title action directly contesting the legal ownership of the beautiful colonial home in Connecticut. But Marcus was a man who believed in absolute total destruction. He did not just want to contest the title, he wanted to completely paralyze the asset. He drafted a massive forensic fraud lien and quietly filed it directly with the local county clerk office where the house was located. The lien was deeply embedded into the public property records, forever attaching my name and my trust fund to the deed. The absolute sheer genius of this specific legal maneuver was its incredibly quiet nature. Unless Julian or Maya actively tried to sell the house or attempted to refinance the mortgage, they would never be automatically notified by the county that the massive lien even existed. They were currently living blissfully inside a beautiful suburban house that was now legally locked inside an invisible heavy steel vault. And I held the absolute only key to the door. I remember standing by the large floor-to-ceiling windows in Marcus' office looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. I felt a profound, intoxicating sense of absolute power completely wash over my entire body. The pathetic, desperate tears I had cried while sitting in my freezing car outside that Connecticut house felt like they belonged to an entirely different lifetime. I was no longer a victim weeping over a broken marriage. I was the architect of his absolute ruin. I had successfully attached a massive invisible heavy anchor directly to my husband's neck. Every single night when I went home and laid next to him in the dark, I smiled to myself. I knew that his perfect suburban fantasy with his beautiful mistress and his secret child was already completely destroyed. He just did not know it yet. He was a dead man walking through his own life. For the next 2 weeks, my life settled into a strange, terrifying rhythm of absolute deception. I continued my demanding job at the auditing firm during the day. At night, I came home and played the role of the devoted, apologetic wife flawlessly. I helped Sarah coordinate the expensive catering menus and the massive floral arrangements for Julian rapidly approaching 36th birthday gala. I sat at Sunday dinners with his parents Thomas and Victoria, listening to their condescending remarks and smiling politely, while knowing I was about to completely obliterate their entire social standing. But a predator always senses when the temperature of their environment begins to change. Exactly 14 days after Marcus secretly filed the forensic liens, a massive catastrophic shift occurred in Julian behavior. His primary commercial lenders, the massive conservative banks backing the Riverfront Plaza project, suddenly announced a routine but highly aggressive external financial audit of all his active development accounts. It was a completely standard operating procedure for commercial loans of that massive size, but for Julian, it was a sudden, terrifying emergency. He knew exactly what was hidden inside those ledgers. He knew that if aggressive external auditors started digging deeply into his massive vendor disbursements, they would immediately find the recurring payments to Apex Holdings. They would easily trace the bleeding escrow accounts, and they would uncover the massive $500,000 corporate embezzlement. Julian was incredibly arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. He realized instantly that his massive commercial company was completely doomed. He knew the banks were going to seize his assets and destroy his professional reputation. And when a narcissist realizes his primary world is collapsing, he immediately scrambles to protect his backup plan. Julian knew he needed to protect his most valuable hidden asset. He needed to make absolutely sure that the $1.2 million Connecticut house was completely and entirely insulated from his impending massive corporate bankruptcy. He needed to completely sever the property deed from his shell company, Apex Holdings, and transfer the full legal ownership entirely into Maya's name. If the house belonged solely to his mistress, the commercial banks could never touch it when his primary company inevitably defaulted. He could simply let the Riverfront Plaza project burn to the ground, file for corporate bankruptcy, and walk away to start a brand new wealthy life in Connecticut with his second family. But there was one massive legal hurdle standing directly in his way. Because the original purchase funds had flowed through our commingled marital business accounts, his expensive, shady defense lawyers informed him that he needed a signed legal waiver to make the property transfer absolutely bulletproof. He needed his legal wife to officially sign away any potential future claim to the shell company assets before the deed could be cleanly transferred to Maya. He needed my absolute legal compliance. The trap was finally triggered on a quiet, rainy Tuesday evening. I was sitting at the massive granite island in our custom kitchen, drinking a cup of green tea and reviewing a legitimate tax file for work. Julian walked into the kitchen looking incredibly tense and deeply exhausted. The stress of the impending commercial bank audit was physically eating away at his perfect, handsome face. He poured himself a massive glass of expensive scotch and took a long, deep swallow before walking over to me. He forced his facial muscles to relax into a smooth, charming smile that completely failed to reach his panicked eyes. He set a thick manila folder down on the granite countertop directly in front of my teacup. He kept his voice incredibly casual, entirely light, and completely unbothered. He told me that his primary corporate accountants were frantically trying to clean up some old minor vendor files before the annoying bank auditors arrived next week. He slid a crisp white document out of the folder and placed a heavy silver pen right next to it. He told me it was just a completely routine tax waiver for a defunct consulting vendor he used years ago. He gently rubbed my shoulders with his warm hands, leaning down to kiss the side of my neck. He softly asked me if I could just quickly sign the bottom line so he could get his paranoid accountants off his back. I looked down at the crisp white paper resting on the granite counter. I did not immediately reach for the heavy silver pen. I slowly scanned the dense black text, reading the complex legal jargon with the trained eye of a senior corporate auditor. It was absolutely not a routine tax document. It was an irrevocable asset relinquishment form. It was the exact document he desperately needed to transfer the Connecticut house entirely into my name and leave me holding the massive smoking crater of his commercial debt. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady. He had absolutely no idea that the house he was desperately trying to give away already belonged entirely to me. I looked at the signature line waiting for my name. I looked at the man who had lied to me for 6 consecutive years, and I knew exactly how I was going to make him sign his own absolute destruction. I stared down at the crisp white paper resting on the cold granite countertop. The kitchen was completely silent, except for the low rhythmic hum of the massive stainless steel refrigerator. Julian stood just inches away from me, his expensive sandalwood cologne suffocating the air between us. He was waiting for me to pick up the heavy silver pen and sign my name. He had casually presented the document as a routine tax waiver for a defunct consulting vendor. He played the part of the stressed, exhausted business owner perfectly, but he was entirely unaware that he was standing next to a woman who made a highly lucrative living by destroying complex financial lies. I did not immediately reach for the pen. I let my eyes trace the dense black text, scanning the paragraphs with the trained, meticulous eye of a senior corporate auditor. The document was an absolute masterpiece of predatory legal deception. Buried deep within the third paragraph, under a thick layer of incredibly dry administrative jargon, was the exact lethal clause Marcus had warned me about. It was an irrevocable asset relinquishment form. The legal language specifically stated that the undersigned spouse willingly waived any and all present or future claims to the properties and liquid assets held under the corporate umbrella of Apex Holdings. If I signed my name on that solid black line, I would be legally handing over the $1.2 million Connecticut house directly to his mistress. I would be completely severing my only legal tie to the massive $2.5 million he had violently stolen from my family trust fund. I would be locking myself entirely out of the lifeboat while his massive commercial company sank to the bottom of the ocean. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of his plan sent a wave of absolute freezing rage cascading through my entire body. He truly believed I was nothing more than an obedient, financially blind appliance. He believed he could just slide a piece of paper across a kitchen island and steal my grandfather's legacy right out from under me. I kept my face perfectly still, maintaining the soft, tired expression of an overworked wife. I reached out and gently touched the edge of the paper with my index finger. I needed to buy myself exactly 3 minutes to execute the trap Marcus and I had meticulously built. I looked up at Julian and offered him a highly convincing apologetic smile. I told him that the document looked completely fine, but the external vendor identification number listed in the second paragraph was missing a crucial digit. I kept my voice incredibly light and entirely professional. I explained that if the bank auditors saw an incomplete vendor identification number on a notarized tax waiver, it would immediately trigger a secondary internal review and drastically delay his commercial project clearance. The absolute last thing Julian wanted was a secondary bank review. A flash of genuine panic crossed his handsome face. He looked down at the paper, cursing softly under his breath about the sheer incompetence of his highly paid corporate lawyers. I placed my hand gently over his forearm. I told him not to worry at all. I told him I had the exact master vendor directory saved on my secure work laptop in my home office. I offered to quickly run down the hall, correct the missing digit on the digital file, and print a fresh, flawless copy for us to sign. Julian let out a massive sigh of relief. His tense shoulders completely relaxed. He leaned forward and kissed my cheek, telling me I was an absolute lifesaver. He told me to hurry because he wanted to get the paperwork filed first thing in the morning. As I turned to walk out of the kitchen, his cell phone buzzed loudly against the granite countertop. I glanced back over my shoulder just in time to see his face light up with a soft, genuine smile as he unlocked the screen. It was not a business email. The soft chime was the exact specific notification tone he used for his hidden messaging application. He was texting Maya. He was standing in the kitchen. I paid for drinking the expensive scotch I bought him, actively texting the woman he was trying to give my stolen money to. I walked down the long hardwood hallway toward my locked home office. Every single step I took felt incredibly heavy and entirely deliberate. I closed the heavy brass handle behind me and immediately locked the door. The room was dark except for the bright glowing screen of my computer monitor. I did not open any digital vendor directories. I did not correct any typographical errors. Instead, I walked directly over to the heavy fireproof safe hidden discreetly inside my bottom desk drawer. I quickly entered the complex numerical combination. The heavy steel door clicked open. Resting perfectly flat on the bottom shelf was a crisp white document safely tucked inside a plain manila folder. It was the exact legal Trojan horse Marcus had drafted for me 3 days ago. I pulled the document out of the safe and placed it under the bright desk lamp. To the untrained eye, the document looked absolutely identical to the one Julian was currently waiting for in the kitchen. Marcus had painstakingly matched the exact legal font, the specific margin widths, and the paragraph structuring of Julian's standard corporate contracts. The header of the document bore the exact same mundane title regarding vendor tax liability waivers, but the interior text was a completely different, devastating reality. Marcus had weaponized the legal concept of cross-collateralization. The document stated that in order to immediately satisfy the outstanding marital debt created by the unauthorized diversion of the trust fund capital, the primary shareholder of the commercial development firm completely and irrevocably surrendered 100% of his executive voting shares and corporate equity directly to his legal spouse. It was an absolute corporate execution. If Julian signed the bottom line of this specific paper, he would no longer own his own massive real estate development company. He would unknowingly hand me the absolute total control of his entire financial empire as direct collateral for the money he had stolen. The sheer magnitude of the weapon I was holding made my hands tremble slightly. I was about to completely dismantle a man life with a single drop of ink. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to completely steady. I smoothed the crisp edges of the paper, placed it inside the manila folder, and unlocked my office door. The walk back down the hardwood hallway felt entirely different. I was no longer a victim walking through a house built on lies. I was an apex predator moving silently toward a completely oblivious target. When I stepped back into the bright custom kitchen, Julian had not moved an inch. He was leaning heavily against the granite island, his entire posture completely relaxed. Both of his hands were gripping his smartphone, and his thumbs were moving rapidly across the glowing screen. He was completely engrossed in his digital conversation with Maya. He was probably making promises to her. He was probably telling his mistress that the final legal hurdle was about to be cleared, and that the beautiful colonial house in Connecticut would finally be entirely hers. He did not even look up from his phone when I walked up to the island. I slid the new, freshly printed document out of the manila folder and placed it perfectly flat on the cold granite directly next to his empty scotch glass. I kept my voice incredibly calm, entirely soothing and completely flat. I told him I fixed the missing identification number and that the document was now absolutely perfect. I picked up the heavy silver pen and held it out toward him. I told him that since the document involved the internal transfer of corporate liability, his legal signature was required on the primary authorization line first before I could sign as the secondary acknowledging spouse. Julian finally looked up from his phone. His eyes were slightly glazed, entirely distracted by whatever romantic fantasy he was currently constructing with the woman 40 miles away. He did not read a single word on the new page. He did not scan the paragraphs. He did not check the headers. His massive, blinding arrogance convinced him that he was the absolute smartest person in the room. He believed his wife was just a highly efficient administrative assistant, completely eager to please him. He took the heavy silver pen from my hand. He placed the tip of the pen directly onto the solid black line at the bottom of the page. My entire universe narrowed down to the tiny metallic point of that pen. I completely stopped breathing. The kitchen was absolutely silent, except for the sharp scratching sound of the dark blue ink flowing across the crisp white paper. He signed his full legal name with a rapid, confident flourish. He dotted the letter I and crossed the letter T with absolute aggressive certainty. He did not hesitate for a single microscopic fraction of a second. Julian casually tossed the silver pen back onto the granite countertop. He immediately picked his smartphone back up, completely eager to return to his hidden conversation. He did not even look at the document again. He softly muttered a quick thank you and told me to just sign my portion and file it away with the rest of the boring tax returns. He turned his back to me, completely dismissing my presence, and walked slowly out of the kitchen toward the living room, typing rapidly on his screen. I stood entirely alone in the bright kitchen. I looked down at the piece of paper resting on the granite island. The dark blue ink of his signature was still slightly wet, reflecting the bright overhead lights. He had just signed away his entire commercial real estate empire. He had just legally surrendered everything he had built over the last decade entirely to me. And he had done it while actively texting the exact woman he was desperately trying to protect. A cold, terrifying smile slowly spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had just successfully amputated a cancerous limb without the patient ever feeling the blade. I carefully picked up the document, holding it by the very edges. I did not sign my name next to his. My signature was entirely unnecessary for the corporate share transfer to become legally binding under Marco's brilliant drafting. I slid the executed document safely back into the manila folder. The trap was no longer just a theoretical legal strategy. It was a tangible, fully executed reality. Julian Sterling was officially a completely bankrupt man. He just had absolutely no idea that his entire world had just ended right there on our kitchen counter. I turned off the kitchen lights, plunging the room into total darkness, and walked silently back down the hallway to lock his absolute destruction safely away inside my fireproof vault. The evening of Julian's 36th birthday and corporate milestone gala finally arrived. The massive event was held at the highly exclusive downtown botanical gardens, exactly as his sister Sarah had meticulously planned. The sheer financial excess of the evening was absolutely staggering. thousands of imported white orchids hung from the soaring glass ceiling of the massive conservatory. A towering 5-tier champagne fountain overflowed with incredibly expensive vintage sparkling wine, reflecting the soft amber glow of the crystal chandeliers. I walked into the grand ballroom wearing a floor-length, custom-tailored midnight blue silk gown that cost more than a reliable used car. I looked like the absolute epitome of a wealthy, successful, supportive corporate wife. The heavy silk brushed against the polished marble floor as I walked. My hair was professionally styled, my makeup was absolutely flawless, and my heart was beating with the slow, heavy rhythm of a seasoned executioner walking up the steps to the scaffold. Julian walked confidently beside me, with his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. He was wearing a bespoke black velvet tuxedo that made him look like a Hollywood actor playing the role of a billionaire. He was practically vibrating with massive, arrogant energy. Tonight was supposed to be the absolute crowning achievement of his entire professional and personal life. Julian truly believed he had completely won. He believed he had successfully outsmarted the massive commercial bank auditors, outsmarted his wealthy, naive wife, and perfectly secured his secret double life. In his incredibly arrogant mind, the irrevocable asset relinquishment document I had tricked him into signing 3 days ago was safely sitting inside his corporate lawyer's filing cabinet, completely protecting the $1.2 million Connecticut house for his mistress. He thought he was completely invincible. As we moved through the massive crowd of 200 wealthy investors, corporate politicians, and elite socialites, Julian worked the room with absolute masterful charisma. He shook hands, he laughed at terrible jokes, and he accepted lavish praise for the supposed incredible success of the Riverfront Plaza project. The project that was secretly 60 days away from catastrophic financial default. He would occasionally pull me close to him, kissing my cheek in front of his wealthy investors, loudly declaring that he could never have built his massive empire without his beautiful, brilliant wife standing firmly by his side. Every single time he kissed me, I offered him a warm, radiant smile. It was the absolute performance of a lifetime. I smiled because I knew that the heavy manila folder currently resting inside the briefcase of my brilliant lawyer Marcus was about to completely vaporize this man's entire existence. The rest of the Sterling family was out in full force playing their own pathetic, deceptive roles. His parents, Thomas and Victoria, were holding court near the massive ice sculpture, radiating smug parental pride. Victoria was wearing a ridiculously heavy diamond necklace that I had personally purchased for her last Christmas. When she saw me, she enveloped me in a cloud of heavy floral perfume, kissing the air next to my cheek and telling me what a wonderful job I had done supporting her perfect son. Sarah was frantically rushing around the ballroom barking orders at the terrified catering staff to ensure the expensive crab cakes were served at the absolute perfect temperature. She avoided making direct eye contact with me, completely terrified by the brief confrontation we had in her kitchen weeks ago. But she still managed to raise her crystal champagne glass to me from across the room, pantomiming a toast to our wonderful family unity. I raised my glass back to her, taking a slow sip of the cold, dry champagne. The hypocrisy in the room was so incredibly thick, it was almost suffocating. They were all celebrating a massive towering lie funded entirely by my stolen family legacy. But I did not feel angry anymore. The searing hot rage that had consumed me for the past month had crystallized into something incredibly cold and absolutely unbreakable. I was just waiting for the perfect moment to drop the match. And then the absolute final piece of the devastating puzzle fell perfectly into place. I excused myself from an incredibly boring conversation with a city zoning commissioner and walked toward the edge of the grand ballroom to catch my breath. The glass walls of the conservatory looked out into the dark, sprawling gardens. As I turned back to survey the massive crowd, my eyes scanned the perimeter of the room, passing over the catering stations and the string quartet playing softly in the corner. That is when I saw her. Standing near the heavy velvet drapes at the very back of the ballroom, near the secondary exit doors, was Maya. The breathtaking audacity of my husband was absolutely staggering. He had actually invited his secret mistress to his massive corporate gala. He had brought the woman he was secretly funding with my stolen trust fund directly into the exact same room as his legal wife. She was wearing a simple but incredibly elegant black cocktail dress. She was standing entirely alone, holding a half-empty glass of wine, watching Julian work the crowd from a safe distance. She looked at him with an expression of absolute pure adoration. She truly believed he was a massive corporate titan. She believed he was the brilliant, wealthy man who had bought her $1 million house in Connecticut and who was going to take care of her and little Leo forever. She had absolutely no idea that the man she was staring at was completely functionally bankrupt. She did not know that the beautiful house she was currently living in legally belonged to the woman standing 100 feet away from her in a midnight blue silk gown. I stood perfectly still, near the cold glass wall, studying Maya from across the crowded ballroom. I did not feel any jealousy toward her. I did not feel the desperate, agonizing heartbreak of a betrayed spouse. Looking at her standing there, in the shadows, I actually felt a strange, cold wave of genuine pity wash over me. She was just another completely disposable asset in Julian's massive, fraudulent portfolio. He had lied to her just as expertly as he had lied to me. He had promised her a beautiful, secure future, built entirely on stolen money and fragile corporate debt. Julian suddenly broke away from a group of wealthy bankers and subtly caught Maya's eye across the room. He gave her a very small, incredibly private smile. It was a secret micro-expression of shared intimacy directly in the middle of a massive crowded room. Maya smiled back, softly biting her lower lip. It was the exact same sickeningly sweet dynamic I had witnessed from the front seat of my freezing car outside her house 40 miles away. Julian was actively playing both sides of the chessboard, believing he was an absolute invincible grandmaster. The string quartet suddenly stopped playing. The heavy ambient noise of 200 wealthy guests chatting and laughing began to slowly die down. Sarah tapped a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute, the sharp ringing sound echoing loudly through the massive glass conservatory. It was time for the primary speeches. It was time for the loving wife to take the stage and honor her brilliant, successful husband. The massive digital projector screen behind the main podium hummed to life, displaying a massive high-resolution photograph of Julian smiling confidently on a construction site. Julian walked over to me, his eyes shining with absolute arrogant triumph. He took my hand, his skin warm and slightly damp with expensive cologne. He leaned in, incredibly close, so only I could hear him over the polite applause of the crowd. He whispered that he loved me, and that he could not wait to hear my beautiful speech. I looked deeply into his eyes, maintaining my flawless warm smile. I told him it was going to be a presentation he would remember for the rest of his natural life. I gently pulled my hand out of his grasp, smoothed the heavy silk of my midnight blue gown, and began the long, slow walk toward the brightly lit podium. The entire room was completely focused on me. Julian's parents were beaming with pride. Maya was watching from the shadows, and my husband was waiting to be crowned. The massive heavy trap was completely set, and my finger was resting firmly on the trigger. The applause was a deafening roar as I walked up the 3 carpeted steps to the elevated stage. The bright spotlight hit my face, blinding me for a fraction of a second before my vision adjusted to the massive sea of expectant faces. 200 of the most wealthy and influential people in Chicago were looking directly at me. I stepped behind the clear acrylic podium and adjusted the slender black microphone. The room slowly quieted down. I could hear the faint clinking of crystal glasses and the soft hum of the massive air conditioning units above the glass conservatory roof. Julian was standing in the very front row, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his velvet tuxedo. He was beaming. He looked exactly like a king, waiting for his queen to publicly place the heavy golden crown upon his head. Off to his right, his parents Thomas and Victoria were watching me with polite, patronizing smiles. And way in the back, standing entirely alone, near the towering swan eye sculpture, was Maya. She was holding her breath, waiting to hear about the wonderful man she loved. I placed my hands flat on the edges of the cold acrylic podium. I took a slow, deep breath. The air smelled like expensive roasted meats and imported orchids. This was it. The absolute point of no return. I leaned into the microphone and let my voice project across the massive ballroom. I started exactly the way they expected me to. I said that building a massive real estate empire requires an incredible amount of blind trust. I kept my voice warm and steady, letting the natural acoustics of the room amplify my words. I told the crowd of seasoned investors and corporate bankers that when Julian first came to me with his vision for the Riverfront Plaza project, I knew he was a man who possessed a very unique set of skills. I saw Julian chuckle softly in the front row. The audience offered a polite, light-hearted murmur of agreement. I continued looking directly into my husband's eyes. I said that true success in commercial development is not just about pouring concrete or securing zoning permits. It is about how meticulously you manage your hidden assets. It is about how creatively you can move capital from one place to another without anyone ever noticing. A few of the older bankers in the room nodded approvingly, completely missing the lethal double meaning hidden inside my words. I told them that Julian Sterling was an absolute master of creative asset management. I said he was a man who believed in deep, extensive diversification. He believed in building completely separate portfolios. I paused for exactly 2 seconds, letting the silence hang heavy in the completely captivated room. Then I reached into the hidden pocket of my silk gown and pulled out a small black remote control. I did not look at the AV technician. I simply pressed the primary button. The massive digital projector mounted on the ceiling clicked loudly. The screen behind me, which was supposed to display a romantic, highly curated montage of our 8-year marriage, suddenly flashed bright white. The sudden change in lighting cast long, sharp shadows across the front rows. When the image finally resolved, there were no wedding photos. There were no pictures of our vacations in Aspen. Instead, a massive, highly detailed financial spreadsheet filled the entire 20-foot screen. At the very top, in bold black letters, was the name Apex Holdings, LLC. I did not turn around to look at the screen. I knew exactly what was on it. I looked directly down at Julian. The arrogant, confident smile completely vanished from his handsome face in a single terrifying instant. He stared up at the massive spreadsheet, his dark eyes widening in absolute sheer horror. All the color drained rapidly from his skin, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. I leaned back into the microphone, my voice dropping the warm, supportive tone entirely. My voice became incredibly cold, entirely flat, and absolutely merciless. I told the audience that I wanted to take this special opportunity to highlight Julian's most impressive and highly secretive investment strategy to date. The room grew incredibly quiet. The polite smiles on the faces of the investors slowly began to fade, replaced by a creeping sense of profound confusion. I began to walk them through the numbers, just like I was conducting a massive corporate audit in a boardroom. I pointed to the recurring monthly payments of exactly $4,800. I explained that Julian had brilliantly established a completely anonymous shell company called Apex Holdings exactly 6 years ago. I told the room full of sophisticated financial experts that Julian was using this shell company to systematically siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars directly out of the primary escrow accounts for the Riverfront Plaza project. A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed through the front rows. The commercial bankers who had personally underwritten the massive loans for that exact project suddenly sat up perfectly straight. Their expensive wine glasses were lowered to the tables. They were no longer attending a birthday party. They were suddenly sitting in the middle of a massive active crime scene. I kept my voice perfectly steady, projecting complete authority. I told them that my husband had expertly disguised these massive fraudulent withdrawals as specialized environmental consulting fees. I explained that over the last 72 months, he had illegally embezzled over $420,000 from his own commercial development firm. Complete, absolute chaos began to ripple through the massive ballroom. A senior loan officer from the primary lending bank immediately stood up from his table, his face flushed dark red with sudden explosive anger. He began furiously typing on his cell phone, entirely ignoring the party around him. Julian was completely paralyzed. He tried to take a step forward toward the stage, but his legs seemed completely unable to support his weight. He opened his mouth to speak, to shout something to stop the presentation, but his throat was completely dry. No sound came out. He just stared at me, his entire perfect world violently collapsing into ash. I pressed the button on the small black remote a second time. The massive screen behind me transitioned to a new slide. This slide displayed the highly confidential internal bank records, proving the Riverfront Plaza project was currently bleeding out and was less than 60 days away from a catastrophic massive default. I looked directly at the investors and told them that the massive building they thought they were funding was actually functionally bankrupt because the primary developer was actively stealing their money. The noise in the room escalated into an angry, panicked murmur. Men in expensive suits were aggressively whispering to each other. Lawyers were already mentally drafting emergency injunctions. I shifted my gaze slightly to the right. Thomas and Victoria Sterling were sitting frozen in their chairs. Victoria's heavy diamond necklace was rising and falling rapidly as she began to hyperventilate. She looked at her son, the golden boy she had relentlessly protected, and realized he was about to go to federal prison. Thomas' face was entirely, completely pale. He was looking around the room, watching his massive social standing and his entire pristine reputation completely vaporize in front of his wealthy country club friends. Sarah had dropped a tray of expensive champagne flutes. The crystal shattered loudly against the marble floor, but nobody in the room even looked in her direction. Everyone was entirely captivated by the massive financial execution taking place on the main stage. They were watching a senior financial auditor completely dissect a white-collar criminal in real time. But I was not finished. The financial destruction was only the first half of my meticulously planned revenge. I pressed the black remote control for the absolute final time. The complex spreadsheets and the bank records vanished from the massive screen. They were immediately replaced by a breathtaking high-resolution drone photograph of a massive, pristine white colonial home in Connecticut. The house looked incredibly beautiful and perfectly peaceful on the massive screen. I gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. I leaned directly into the microphone, and I let my voice carry to the absolute furthest corners of the massive glass conservatory. I told the silent, horrified crowd that Julian did not just steal this massive amount of money to buy expensive cars or luxury watches. I told them he stole the $2.5 million trust fund left to me by my deceased grandfather to buy this exact $1.2 million house. I paused, letting the sheer disgusting magnitude of that betrayal sink into the minds of the audience. Then I delivered the absolute final lethal blow. I told them that Julian bought this beautiful house to completely fund the life of his secret mistress and the 6-year-old son he had successfully hidden from me for our entire marriage. The entire ballroom erupted into an absolute frenzy of shocked gasps and horrified whispers. Julian finally found his voice. He screamed my name. He screamed, "Harper, please stop." He was begging me, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of absolute surrender. But I completely ignored him. I raised my right hand and pointed a single steady finger directly toward the back of the massive ballroom. I pointed straight at the towering swan eye sculpture. I told the crowd that they did not have to take my word for it. I told them that the mistress was actually in attendance tonight. I said her name was Maya, and she was standing right there in the beautiful black cocktail dress. 200 pairs of wealthy, judgmental eyes completely snapped away from the stage and turned violently toward the back of the room. The physical spotlight operator, completely confused by the absolute chaos, instinctively swung the massive bright beam of light away from the podium and swept it across the crowd. The blinding white circle of light landed directly on Maya. She was completely trapped in the blinding beam, standing entirely frozen next to the melting ice sculpture. Her face was an absolute mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at the massive photograph of her own house on the screen. She looked at the complex financial charts proving the money was entirely stolen. And then she looked directly at Julian, the man who had promised her a perfect, secure, wealthy life. The man she thought was a brilliant, successful titan of industry. In that one single devastating moment, Maya realized the absolute horrifying truth. She realized that she did not own that beautiful house. She realized that Julian was not a wealthy developer, but a broke, desperate criminal. She realized she was standing in a room full of furious corporate bankers who were about to strip Julian of absolutely every single asset he had ever touched. Julian spun around, looking desperately at Maya across the massive sea of angry guests. He tried to push his way through the crowd to get to her, to explain, to lie, to manipulate her one last time. But the wealthy investors immediately physically blocked his path. They were grabbing his arms, shouting aggressively in his face, demanding their money back. The absolute chaos was beautiful. It was a perfect violent symphony of total destruction. I stood on the elevated stage, entirely untouched by the massive riot breaking out on the marble floor below me. I looked at the man who had stolen 6 years of my life. I looked at the family who had actively protected his lies. I looked at the mistress who had unknowingly lived inside a house funded by my dead grandfather. I had not just exposed them, I had completely, permanently destroyed the entire foundation of their existence. I stepped back from the clear acrylic podium. I did not say thank you. I did not say goodnight. I simply turned around the heavy midnight blue silk of my gown sweeping gracefully behind me, and I walked slowly down the back steps of the stage, entirely leaving Julian Sterling to be completely ripped apart by the very monsters he had created. The noise in the massive glass conservatory was no longer the polite murmur of a wealthy corporate gathering. It was the deafening, chaotic roar of a total financial panic. 200 elite investors and business partners were simultaneously realizing that their massive capital investments were tied to a man who had just been exposed as a reckless white-collar criminal. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. The string quartet had completely abandoned their instruments and were standing in the corner watching the absolute destruction unfold. I stood at the edge of the elevated stage looking down at the massive riot I had just intentionally triggered. My heart was beating with a slow, steady rhythm. I felt absolutely no fear. I felt nothing but the cold, sharp satisfaction of a perfectly executed audit. Julian was completely unraveling. The arrogant, charismatic real estate developer was gone. In his place was a terrified, desperate, cornered animal. He spun away from the furious crowd of bankers who were screaming demands at him and looked wildly up at the stage. He lunged toward the carpeted steps, his expensive black velvet tuxedo jacket snagging on the edge of a massive floral arrangement. He tore the dark fabric, but he did not even notice. He scrambled up the stairs toward the clear acrylic podium. His face was covered in a thick layer of cold sweat, and his eyes were wide with absolute sheer panic. He threw his body against the podium, completely shoving me to the side. I did not fight him. I willingly stepped back, letting the heavy midnight blue silk of my gown drag across the floor. I crossed my arms and watched him completely self-destruct. Julian grabbed the slender black microphone with both of his shaking hands. He gripped it so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. He leaned directly into the microphone, and his voice echoed through the massive ballroom in a high-pitched, desperate shout. He told the crowd to stop talking. He screamed for everyone to please calm down and listen to him. The sudden, loud screech of audio feedback pierced the room, forcing several guests to cover their ears. But Julian did not stop. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me and began to loudly play the absolute victim. He told the 200 wealthy guests that his wife was completely insane. He shouted that I was a deeply disturbed, hysterical woman who was having a massive psychological breakdown. He lied with the desperate, frantic energy of a man drowning in freezing water. He told the investors that I was just a jealous, bitter woman who had completely fabricated the massive financial spreadsheets projected on the screen behind him. He swore on his life that the bank records were forged. He claimed that the entire presentation was just a pathetic domestic dispute, dragging his pristine corporate name through the mud because I was angry about his long working hours. He looked directly at the senior loan officers from the primary lending bank. He begged them to believe him. He promised them that the Riverfront Plaza project was completely solvent and that their massive capital investments were entirely safe. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. He told the crowd that Apex Holdings was just a standard tax strategy and that the house in Connecticut was just a random corporate asset. He was lying so fast and so aggressively that he was actually starting to trip over his own words. But the wealthy investors were not fools. They were seasoned corporate predators. They looked at the massive, highly detailed digital spreadsheets glowing on the 20-foot screen. They saw the exact routing numbers. They saw the specific legal escrow accounts. They knew a perfectly executed forensic audit when they saw one. Nobody believed a single word Julian was screaming. The entire room looked at him with absolute total disgust. and then the heavy oak double doors at the very back of the grand ballroom swung open. The noise of the crowd slightly dipped as a new presence entered the massive room. It was Marcus. My brilliant corporate litigator brother-in-law walked slowly into the chaotic conservatory. He was wearing a flawless charcoal grey suit, his posture perfectly straight, and his face set in a cold, completely unreadable mask. He did not look like a guest attending a birthday gala. He looked like an executioner arriving to finish his job. Walking exactly one step behind Marcus was a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a plain beige trench coat. The process server. The crowd of panicked investors naturally parted for Marcus, sensing the absolute heavy authority radiating from him. Sarah saw her husband walking through the crowd and let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She tried to step forward to intercept him, to beg him to stop the madness, but Marcus completely ignored her. He did not even glance in her direction. He kept his dark, piercing eyes locked entirely on the terrified man, sweating on the elevated stage. Thomas and Victoria Sterling shrank back into the shadows, completely paralyzed by the sheer humiliation of watching their own son-in-law publicly dismantle their golden boy. Marcus stopped right at the base of the carpeted steps. He stood entirely calm amidst the massive swirling chaos of the ballroom. He looked up at Julian, who was still desperately gripping the acrylic podium. Marcus did not need a microphone. His deep, resonant voice completely cut through the panicked noise of the crowd. He told Julian to step away from the podium and shut his mouth. The absolute cold authority in Marcus' voice hit Julian like a physical blow. Julian stopped screaming. He looked down at Marcus, his chest heaving with shallow, frantic breaths. Julian tried to leverage his family connection. He leaned over the edge of the stage and begged Marcus to help him explain to the crowd that Harper had gone completely crazy. He told Marcus to use his legal expertise to prove the spreadsheets were fake. Marcus offered a slow, cold, predatory smile. It was the absolute most terrifying expression I had ever seen. Marcus reached his hand back, and the tall process server immediately placed a thick, heavy manila folder directly into his palm. Marcus looked up at Julian and told him that he was absolutely right about one thing. He told Julian that he was indeed going to use his legal expertise to explain exactly what was happening to the crowd. Marcus turned slightly so his voice would carry to the front rows of the furious investors and the senior commercial bankers. He held the thick manila folder up for everyone to see. He announced that he was the senior partner at his corporate litigation firm and that he was currently acting as the primary legal counsel for Harper Sterling. The entire front section of the ballroom fell completely silent, eager to hear the brutal legal reality. Marcus turned his attention back to Julian. He opened the manila folder and pulled out a crisp white document. He held it up. It was the exact irrevocable asset relinquishment form Julian had signed on our kitchen granite island 3 days ago. Marcus spoke slowly and deliberately, making sure every single word landed like a massive heavy stone. He told Julian that when he blindly signed the routine tax waiver for his defunct consulting vendor earlier this week, he had made a catastrophic administrative error. Marcus explained the beautiful, brutal concept of cross-collateralization to the completely silent crowd. He told Julian that because he had illegally stolen $2.5 million from his wife-protected family trust fund and routed it through his primary commercial escrow accounts, he had legally polluted his entire corporate structure. Julian's face went from pale gray to completely translucent. He stared at the piece of paper in Marcus' hand, his eyes darting frantically across the black text. He recognized his own dark blue ink signature, perfectly crossing the solid black line at the bottom of the page. Marcus told Julian that the document he had so willingly signed while actively texting his secret mistress was not a tax waiver. It was a complete corporate equity surrender. Marcus' voice rang out loud and clear. He announced to the investors, the bankers, and the entire Sterling family that as of 48 hours ago, Julian Sterling no longer owned a single executive voting share in his own real estate development firm. Marcus told Julian that he had legally, willingly, and irrevocably transferred 100% of his corporate ownership directly to his wife, as primary collateral for the massive stolen funds. The sheer shock of the revelation hit Julian so hard his knees physically buckled. He grabbed the clear acrylic podium to stop himself from completely collapsing onto the stage. He was entirely bankrupt. He did not own the Riverfront Plaza project. He did not own Apex Holdings. He did not even own the name of his own massive company anymore. I owned absolutely everything. But Marcus was an absolute master of total destruction, and he was not finished yet. He pulled a second thick document from the manila folder. This one had a heavy blue county clerk stamp pressed onto the top right corner. Marcus looked directly into Julian's terrified eyes and told him about the Connecticut house. Marcus told Julian that because the stolen trust fund money was used to purchase the $1.2 million suburban home, the legal doctrine of constructive trust applied. Marcus announced to the entire room that he had successfully filed a massive forensic fraud lien against the property deed. The house did not belong to Julian. The house absolutely did not belong to Maya. The house was now legally frozen and entirely controlled by Harper Sterling. Marcus told Julian that the locks on the beautiful white colonial home had already been legally changed by a county sheriff deputy 2 hours ago, while Julian was busy drinking champagne at his birthday party. The process server walked up the carpeted steps. He did not show any emotion. He simply shoved the heavy stack of executed legal documents directly into Julian's shaking chest. He loudly declared that Julian had been officially served. The papers fell from Julian completely. Numb fingers, scattering across the stage floor. He was a man with absolutely nothing left. He had no money. He had no company. He had no house. He was just an empty hollow fraud standing on a stage that he no longer owned. And then the absolute final trigger was pulled. The crowd near the back of the room violently parted as a woman shoved her way aggressively toward the front. It was Maya. She had listened to every single word Marcus had spoken. She had watched the massive financial charts on the screen. And the reality of her own massive impending poverty had completely shattered her adoration for Julian. She was not a weeping, heartbroken woman betrayed by love. She was a furious, terrified woman who had just realized she was completely homeless. She pushed past a group of wealthy bankers and stormed directly up to the edge of the elevated stage. Her beautiful black cocktail dress swished violently around her legs. Maya pointed an accusing finger directly at Julian's face. Her voice was shrill, hysterical, and completely filled with pure venom. She screamed at him in front of the entire massive crowd. She demanded to know if it was true. She screamed that he had promised her the house was completely paid off and entirely secure. She yelled that she had quit her job because he promised to take care of her and Leo forever. She completely exposed him in front of his wealthy peers, shouting that he had promised to leave his terrible cold wife and marry her as soon as his massive commercial project was finished. She screamed that he was a pathetic, broke liar and that he had completely ruined her life. She demanded to know where she and her son were supposed to sleep tonight, since the sheriff had literally locked them out of their own house. Julian looked down at his beautiful mistress, the woman he had risked his entire empire to protect. He had absolutely nothing to offer her. He could not charm his way out of a forensic corporate lien. He could not manipulate a frozen bank account. He just stood there, stuttering, completely unable to form a single coherent sentence. Maya let out a loud, disgusted shriek. She threw her half-empty glass of wine directly at him. The expensive dark red liquid splashed heavily across his pristine white tuxedo shirt and the lapel of his velvet jacket, looking exactly like a massive bleeding wound. She turned around and violently shoved her way back through the crowd, screaming that she was calling her own lawyers to sue him for child support and absolute fraud. The violent, massive public confrontation between the broke developer and his furious homeless mistress was the absolute final signal for the corporate investors. They had seen more than enough. The entire front section of the ballroom erupted into a massive, chaotic scramble. The senior loan officers from the primary lending bank pulled out their cell phones, immediately dialing their emergency corporate legal teams. Wealthy private investors were shouting over each other, demanding emergency injunctions to freeze whatever liquid capital was left in the Riverfront Plaza escrow accounts. They realized that the company they invested in was now entirely owned by me and that Julian was completely legally radioactive. They were actively turning on him, exactly like starving wolves, sensing a massive weakness in their pack leader. The noise was absolutely deafening. The panic was entirely absolute. Julian was standing on the stage, completely covered in dark red wine, surrounded by scattered legal documents, completely abandoned by his furious mistress, and aggressively hunted by his wealthy investors. He looked entirely broken. I stood quietly on the edge of the stage, watching the beautiful, absolute chaos. I had not just divorced my husband, I had completely executed his entire reality. I had taken back every single thing he had ever stolen from me, and I had let the massive crushing weight of his own profound arrogance destroy him completely. The legal strike was an absolute perfect total success. The monster was entirely dead, and I was holding the absolute only set of keys to the massive empire he had left behind. The morning after the catastrophic gala, I woke up in my own bed, and for the first time in 6 years, the air in my house felt entirely clean. I walked down to the custom kitchen and brewed a pot of expensive coffee completely unbothered by the absolute destruction I had unleashed the night before. Julian had not come home. He could not come home. Marcus had filed an emergency restraining order based on the massive corporate fraud granting me exclusive legal occupancy of our primary residence while the final asset liquidation was processed. Julian was completely locked out of the beautiful life I had painstakingly built for him. He was a king who had been violently exiled from his own kingdom in a single night, and the brutal reality of his new existence was just beginning to crush him. Early that morning, Julian attempted to walk into the downtown offices of his real estate development firm. He thought he could somehow salvage the situation by rallying his executive team and begging the commercial banks for a temporary grace period. But when the elevator doors opened on his floor, he was greeted by 2 heavily armed security guards and a team of ruthless forensic accountants hired directly by Marcus. The massive glass doors to his corporate suite were physically chained and padlocked. His executive staff had already cleared out their desks, terrified of being indicted as co-conspirators in his massive embezzlement scheme. The primary lending banks did exactly what Marcus predicted they would do. They triggered the catastrophic default clauses, immediately freezing every single operational account tied to the Riverfront Plaza project. Julian tried to access his personal checking accounts, but those had been legally frozen by the county court as part of the massive fraud lien I now held against him. He was standing on a busy downtown Chicago sidewalk, wearing the exact same wine-stained velvet tuxedo from the night before, holding a deactivated keycard and possessing absolutely zero access to a single cent of liquid capital. He was entirely functionally bankrupt. Desperate, terrified, and completely alone, Julian did the only thing a massive narcissist knows how to do when his primary world collapses. He ran directly toward his backup plan. He borrowed a car from a reluctant friend and drove 40 miles out to the beautiful white colonial home in Connecticut. He thought that Maya would somehow comfort him. He believed her love was genuine and that she would stand by his side while he rebuilt his massive empire from scratch. But Julian was about to learn a terrifying lesson about the exact kind of loyalty you purchase with stolen money. When he pulled into the wide paved driveway, he did not see a happy family waiting to greet him on the porch. He saw a massive rented moving truck parked on the front lawn. The heavy wooden front door was propped completely open, and professional movers were rapidly carrying out expensive furniture and heavy cardboard boxes. Julian sprinted up the porch steps and found Maya standing in the center of the empty living room. She was holding little Leo by the hand, her face completely hard and entirely unforgiving. Julian fell to his knees on the hardwood floor, actually crying, begging her to please stay with him. He told her that he would figure it out, that he would start a new company, and that they could still be a perfect family. But Maya just looked down at him with absolute pure disgust. She explicitly told him that the only reason she had ever agreed to be his secret second family was because he provided a flawless, wealthy financial safety net. She brutally informed him that she had no interest in struggling with a broke, disgraced criminal who did not even own the roof over their heads. Without the massive monthly cash payments, without the expensive dinners, and the perfectly funded private school tuition, Julian was completely, entirely useless to her. She told him that she was taking Leo and moving back to her family in Texas that very afternoon. She promised Julian that if he ever tried to contact them again, she would personally hand over all of his secret text messages and hidden cash receipts directly to the federal prosecutors. Julian stayed on his knees, sobbing uncontrollably as Maya walked out the front door, climbed into her loaded vehicle, and drove completely out of his life forever. She abandoned him the exact second the stolen money ran out, proving that his entire second life was nothing more than a hollow, expensive transaction. The loss of Maya and his secret son finally broke the absolute last shred of Julian's fragile sanity. But the universe was not finished punishing him yet. The massive commercial banks were not just going to let him walk away from a ruined, half-built skyscraper. Because the digital paper trail I had meticulously uncovered explicitly proved that Julian had intentionally diverted hundreds of thousands of dollars across state lines to fund the shell company Apex Holdings, he had crossed the threshold from civil liability into massive federal wire fraud. The United States Attorney Office officially opened a sweeping criminal investigation into his corporate practices. Julian was facing a very real, incredibly terrifying minimum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary for gross corporate embezzlement. Completely out of options, completely out of money, and absolutely terrified of going to prison, Julian crawled directly back to the only two people left on the planet who were sick enough to still protect him. He went crying to his parents. Thomas and Victoria Sterling had spent their entire lives cultivating an image of flawless aristocratic wealth in their exclusive Oak Brook suburb. They had actively enabled Julian's toxic behavior. They had sat at my dining room table and eaten my food while knowingly protecting the mistress and the secret child. They had believed their golden boy was completely untouchable. Now the massive bill for their collective arrogance had finally come due. Julian sat sobbing on his parents' expensive imported velvet sofa, begging them to save him from federal prison. He desperately needed a massive high-powered criminal defense team, and he needed millions of dollars in liquid cash to offer the furious commercial banks a massive restitution settlement to keep them from pressing full criminal charges. Thomas and Victoria looked at their broken, pathetic son and realized exactly what they had to do. The financial destruction of the Sterling family was incredibly rapid and absolutely beautiful to quietly observe from afar. In order to generate the massive amount of liquid capital required to keep Julian out of a federal jail cell, Thomas and Victoria had to completely gut their entire pristine existence. They were forced to violently liquidate their massive retirement portfolios, taking catastrophic tax penalties just to access the raw cash. They had to immediately sell off their highly coveted memberships to the elite private country clubs they cherished so deeply. But even that was not enough to satisfy the aggressive banking lawyers. To completely cover the massive restitution Julian owed for the Riverfront Plaza disaster, Thomas was forced to take out a massive predatory reverse mortgage on the sprawling brick estate they had lived in for 30 years. They completely drained every single drop of generational wealth they had spent their entire lives hoarding all to bail out a 36-year-old man who could not stop lying. The absolute worst part for Thomas and Victoria was not just the devastating loss of their money. It was the complete, catastrophic destruction of their social standing. The elite wealthy circles of Chicago are incredibly small and viciously gossipy. The absolute horrifying truth about Julian's massive corporate fraud, his secret mistress, and the complete financial decapitation executed by his own wife became the absolute hottest topic at every single charity gala and private dinner party in the city. The Sterling family name became entirely radioactive. Their wealthy friends completely stopped calling them. Their invitations to elite social events completely dried up overnight. They became absolute total pariahs in the very community they had spent decades desperately trying to dominate. They were suddenly poor, disgraced, and entirely isolated. Julian Sterling, the incredibly arrogant real estate titan who once believed he was an invincible god, was reduced to an absolute ghost of a man. Because his professional reputation was permanently, completely destroyed, no reputable commercial firm in the entire Midwest would ever hire him. He lost his massive luxury vehicles, his expensive tailored suits, and his towering corporate office. He was forced to move into the damp, unfinished basement of his parents' heavily mortgaged Oak Brook estate. He spent his days sitting in the dark, entirely alone, completely suffocated by the massive, crushing weight of his own profound failures. His parents, who were now forced to live on an incredibly strict, fixed budget, deeply resented him for destroying their comfortable golden years. The house that was once filled with loud, arrogant laughter and expensive wine was now a quiet, miserable tomb of bitter regret and financial ruin. They were all completely trapped together inside a permanent prison of their own making. I watched the entire absolute collapse of the Sterling family from the comfortable, secure distance of my new reality. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or sympathy for any of them. Julian and his parents had systematically viewed me as nothing more than a blind, reliable banking appliance designed exclusively to fund their toxic, entitled existence. They had violently taken advantage of my love, my profound grief, and my dead grandfather's legacy to build a massive glittering castle made entirely of lies. But they had tragically forgotten the most basic fundamental rule of structural engineering. If you quietly steal the foundation out from under a massive building, the entire structure will inevitably collapse and completely crush everyone trapped inside. Julian was left with absolutely nothing but the terrible haunting memory of the perfect life he had so arrogantly thrown away. The ruins of his empire were completely swept away, and I was finally entirely free. It has been exactly 14 months since the night I completely dismantled Julian Sterling on the brightly lit stage of his own corporate gala. The legal aftermath of that massive public execution was swift, ruthless, and entirely bloodless because I held absolutely every single piece of leverage. The massive forensic fraud lien that Marcus had strategically placed on the Connecticut house held up perfectly in federal court. Because Julian had unknowingly signed over his entire corporate equity to me in our kitchen, I did not just recover my original $2.5 million trust fund. I completely liquidated the remaining viable assets of his real estate firm. I immediately sold the beautiful white colonial home in Connecticut for well over the original asking price to a lovely young family who had absolutely no idea about the dark, deceptive history hidden inside its pristine walls. Every single dime Julian had stolen, every single dollar he had meticulously funneled into his phantom shell company to fund his secret life was returned directly to my secure private accounts with massive compounding interest. The divorce itself was finalized in a quiet, empty downtown courtroom on a rainy Tuesday morning. Julian did not even show up to the final hearing. He could not afford a competent defense lawyer to fight me, and he had absolutely nothing left to negotiate. I completely erased his name from my financial existence. I legally severed myself from his toxic orbit, and I left him to drown entirely alone in the massive federal investigations he had brought upon himself. Tonight, the air in Chicago is incredibly crisp and completely clear. I am standing on the sprawling private stone terrace of my brand new luxury penthouse located on the 45th floor of a massive downtown high-rise. The entire city is spread out far beneath me like a breathtaking ocean of glittering lights and endless possibilities. I am wearing a simple white silk robe, completely barefoot on the smooth, dark stone tiles, holding a heavy crystal glass of incredibly expensive red wine. I take a slow, deep breath of the freezing night air, and for the very first time in my entire adult life, my chest does not feel heavy. There is absolutely no lingering grief over the imaginary family I thought I was supposed to have. There is no suffocating daily anxiety about keeping a massive narcissistic man happy. The absolute deafening silence of my new autonomous life is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. I look down at the bustling city streets far below, and I finally realize the profound, staggering magnitude of what I have actually accomplished. I did not just survive the ultimate betrayal. I did not just cry and pack my bags and walk away empty-handed like Julian and his highly toxic parents fully expected me to do. I audited his entire existence. I systematically dismantled his fraudulent empire brick by massive brick. And I walked away significantly wealthier and infinitely more powerful than I was when I first met him. The heavy sliding glass door behind me glides open with a soft metallic whisper. Marcus steps out onto the freezing terrace. He's wearing a tailored navy suit, but he has taken off his silk tie and unbuttoned the top of his collar. He looks incredibly relaxed and completely at peace. He looks like a man who has finally dropped a massive suffocating weight off his broad shoulders. Marcus officially finalized his own divorce from Sarah 3 months ago. He completely severed all of his ties with the Sterling family, leaving them to wallow permanently in their own miserable, ruined reputation and their massive, crushing debt. He walks over to the edge of the thick glass balcony, holding his own crystal glass of dark amber scotch. He looks out at the glowing Chicago skyline, and then he looks directly at me. We do not need to say very much to understand each other. The mutual respect between us is absolutely absolute. We are two intelligent people who were brought into a toxic, parasitic family dynamic. We were entirely expected to quietly serve and heavily fund their arrogant, entitled illusions. But instead of breaking under their quiet abuse and their massive financial exploitation, we joined forces and completely burned their false kingdom to the ground. Marcus raises his heavy glass, holding it out toward the glittering city lights. His deep, resonant voice perfectly cuts through the soft, howling wind blowing across the high terrace. He says we should drink to the absolute beauty of a perfectly executed contract and the absolute death of the Sterling family empire. I smile a genuine warm smile that reaches all the way to my eyes for the first time in years. I clink my crystal wineglass gently against his. The soft, clear, ringing sound of the expensive crystal is a perfect note of absolute victory. I tell Marcus that we should also drink to the absolute total eradication of a toxic cancer. We stand side by side in the cold night air, drinking quietly to our true absolute freedom. We cut out the toxicity without a single ounce of hesitation or lingering regret. We protected our peace and we protected our futures. Marcus finishes his drink, gives me a slow nod of profound respect, and steps back inside the warm, brightly lit penthouse, leaving me entirely alone with my thoughts and my perfect, unobstructed view of the world. I lean my forearms against the cool glass railing of the massive balcony. I think deeply about the scared, heartbroken woman who sat freezing in her dark car outside that suburban house in Connecticut over a year ago, holding a crumpled pediatric dental receipt. She feels like an entirely different person to me now. She was a woman who genuinely believed that true love required constant, painful financial and emotional sacrifice. She was a woman who thought her sharp intuition was just silly, irrational paranoia, because the man she loved constantly looked her in the eyes and told her she was acting crazy. I wish I could go back in time and hold her shaking hand in that freezing car. I wish I could tell her exactly what she was truly capable of achieving. I wish I could tell her that she was an absolute apex predator who just had not realized her own massive inherent strength yet. But I do not need to go back in time, because the incredible, ruthless, brilliant woman she finally became is standing right here, completely owning the night sky. The terrifying reality of this modern world is that there are absolute monsters walking freely among us, perfectly hiding behind expensive tailored suits, charming, charismatic smiles, and pristine suburban houses. They will completely weaponize your love against you. They will systematically drain your financial resources and your emotional energy. And then they will look you directly in the eyes and completely gaslight you into believing that you are the one failing them. But you are never truly trapped. You always have the absolute inherent power to change the narrative of your own life. You have the power to stop crying and start aggressively auditing. You have the power to meticulously gather your evidence in total silence. You have the power to use their own massive blinding arrogance as the exact lethal weapon that completely destroys them. You absolutely do not have to be the sad, pathetic victim in the story they are trying to write for you. You can choose to be the absolute architect of their total destruction and the primary author of your own glorious freedom. Ladies, never let a man convince you that your intuition is just paranoia. When the math doesn't add up, audit their life. If you've ever had to become the villain to stop a monster, drop the word justice in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me what city you're watching from. Until next time, keep your receipts.